issues related to any boundary studies and the capital improvement program. During today's meeting, the interim superintendent will present her interim superintendent's recommended fiscal year 2023 capital budget and the FY 2023 through 2028 capital improvements program, along with Supplement A, interim superintendent's recommendation for the Gaithersburg Cluster Elementary School Number 8 boundary study, and Supplement B, interim superintendent's recommendation for the Bethesda, Somerset, and Westbrook Elementary Schools boundary study. Subsequently, the board will hold work sessions on October 28th and November the 9th, as well as hearings for the public to provide testimony on November 2nd, November 4th, and November 8th. The hearing on November 8th is also for those wishing to provide testimony regarding the boundary studies for Gaithersburg number 8 in Bethesda, Somerset, and Westbrook Elementary Schools. The hearings will be held in person and will be open to the public with limited capacity. The board will also accept pre-recorded audio and video submissions for individuals who wish to remain virtual. Information about our meeting and hearing schedule, how to sign up for online hearings, and how to submit testimony is available on our website. If alternatives are offered during the work sessions, the board will hold a hearing on November the 16th. Again, the November 16th hearing will only be held if alternatives are offered on either October 28th or November the 9th. So anyone interested in submitting testimony should start signing up at 12 noon today to speak during the aforementioned hearings. The board will meet on November the 18th to make its decisions on the CIP. In terms of today's meeting, the interim superintendent will present her CIP. If there are items the interim superintendent is recommending that board members wish to modify, it would be helpful for affected communities to know about a potential alternative prior to the public hearings. Therefore, I'm encouraging that we identify any alternatives by the October 28th work session. Before I turn the meeting over to Dr. McKnight, I will just remind board members that this is just the interim superintendent's presentation of the CIP. Although clarifying questions are in order, we will have an opportunity to explore the CIP more in depth and ask our questions during the work sessions. At this time, I'm going to ask my board members to introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Daka.
Judy Daka, good morning.
Ms. Smandrowski.
Good morning, Rebecca Smandrowski.
Ms. Silvestri.
Good morning.
Ms. Evans.
Good morning.
Ms. Harris.
Good morning, everyone.
And Ms. O'Looney.
Good morning.
I'll now turn it over to Dr. McKnight.
Thank you, President Wolf, and good morning to members of the Board of Education. Today we are coming forward to discuss the recommended fiscal year 2023 capital budget and capital improvement program. I'd first like to say thank you so much to our community members who have been very much involved in this process over time. I also want to say thank you to the staff. We have spent weeks together just talking through options that we thought were best for our community and for our school system. And so today I'm excited to be able to share with you how that work has come to full fruition in terms of the recommendations that we are sharing with you. So for the fiscal FY23 year, it is the first year of the biannual capital improvements program review process. In accordance with the Montgomery County Charter, all CIP projects are considered in odd number fiscal years. The Board of Education's requested FY22 capital budget and amendment to the FY21 through 26 CIP totaled $1.732 billion, an increase of $3.7 million more than the previously approved CIP. The County Council adopted FY21 through 26 amended CIP for Montgomery County Public Schools totaling $1.619 billion for the 6-year period, which is a decrease of $112.9 million less than the board's request. And I point that out to you because I think that is critically important for us to remember as we go through and discuss today's recommendation. This adopted CIP included expenditure reductions in the out years for some countywide system projects. There were no delays for individual capital projects as a result of the council assuming additional state aid anticipated through the newly adopted Build to Learn Act of 2020 legislation. MCPS has seen a steady increase in enrollment since 2007-2008 school year. However, the current COVID-19 health pandemic has impacted our student enrollment as well as the student enrollment of many public school systems across the country. The preliminary September 30th, 21 enrollment is 159,005, a one-year decrease of 1,559 students. Now, while this represents a second year of a decline in student enrollment, the decline is at a slower rate than we experienced from the 2019-20 school year to the 2021 school year. Total system school system enrollment is projected to increase to 166,160 students by the 27-28 school year. Now, I share that number with you because this is, of course, a number of years out from where we are right now. But of course, this process is about us really looking at where we're going to be 6-7 years from now. And so we know that our county is one that continues to grow, and right now we are in a pandemic. And so we put that into the context of where we are right now. But we know once we work through the pandemic, families will continue to come into Montgomery County, students will continue to enroll. And so this is our projection, again, of 166,160 students by the 27-28 school year. This projection represents a slight slowdown in enrollment growth in part due to the continued decline in residence births as well as the current COVID-19 health pandemic. Had it not been for those factors, I would say that we would be sharing a number even more significant than the 166,160. We do believe, however, that this decline in enrollment will be temporary, and therefore the capacity projects included in the adopted CIP still are warranted and must remain on their approved schedules. As a result of the COVID-19 health pandemic during the past 18 months, the construction industry has experienced an unprecedented rise in the prices of materials, disruptions in the supply chain, and staffing shortages, which has resulted in an approximate 23% increase in construction costs. And I believe we came and shared some of these realities with the board just a few months ago when this was a result of, again, impact from COVID-19 that we needed to be aware of as it had been impacting our construction at the time. So this is still very much a factor. And so when we think about the cost going along with the CIP, we do have to take that into consideration. So due to these extraordinary circumstances, there are funding shortfalls in many of our capital projects between the budgeted costs and the actual planned expenditures in the adopted CIP. In order to move forward with these adopted capital projects, increases in the total project costs are required to provide the construction funds necessary to maintain previously approved completion dates. So we have to really think about that. If we want to stay and keep our previously approved completion dates of our projects, then we have to take or understand that this all fits into the increases of the total project costs that we are having right now. In addition, as previously stated, the Maryland General Assembly approved the Build to Learn Act of 2020, which provides additional school construction funds beyond the annual statewide allocation for capital projects. Total funds available for MCPS are approximately $460 million, spanning a 10-year period. In order to utilize these funds, our construction projects will need to be bid using prevailing wage rates. Previously, our budget estimates did not include prevailing wage rates because it was more cost-effective to implement capital budget projects without prevailing wage rates due to an increased cost per project of approximately 15%. However, based on the allocation criteria for the Build to Learn Act funding MCPS would receive a substantial increase in school construction funds if these projects were bid using prevailing wage rates. As a result, an increase of local funds is required on many of our capital projects to adjust local project costs to reflect and use of prevailing wage rates. Therefore, my recommended CIP totals $1.738 billion, $119.4 million more than the previously approved CIP. It includes the following. First, maintaining the completion dates of all capital projects included in the adopted CIP. And we do think that is very important in sharing our commitment to those projects. Secondly, providing additional funds to address budget shortfalls to have projects remain on their approved schedules. Third, funding for 4 new individual capital projects. Funding for new countywide initiatives. And finally, funding to increase our countywide systemic projects. In addition to the CIP recommendations, we will present to you my recommendation for the Gaithersburg Elementary School Number 8 boundary study and the Bethesda, Somerset, and Westbrook Elementary Schools boundary study. Today, our presentation will focus on the enrollment forecast, provide an overview of my recommendation for the CIP, and review of the boundary study recommendations. We look forward to our work with you during the coming weeks to prepare the final request by the board for review by the County Council and the County Executive. At this time, I will turn it over to Ms. Jeannie Dawson, Chief of Finance and Operations. The Department of Facilities Management staff will also provide today's presentation. Welcome, Seth and Adrian.
Thank you. We are so excited to be here and spend this time with you today to talk about the capital budget and the improvements program. One of the things I do want to just reiterate that Dr. McKnight has talked about is the experiences within the construction industry and what we have to face with COVID-19. In terms of the 23% increase in the inflation rates, the job labor shortages, and the materials increase, this has impacted our approach to the work. We've talked with our different stakeholders about this. We've discussed and brought this out front, and it definitely is something that we just need to keep considering as we go through this process today. You know, we're very thoughtful about how we've looked at the recommendation that the superintendent is making around geography, facility utilization, stability of the schools, and the demographics of the student population. So we just want to make sure that we really answer any questions and we're able to thoroughly provide this presentation today. Next slide, please. So today's agenda really has 5 main components to it. We'll discuss the student enrollment and the projected enrollment numbers that Dr. McKnight has represented. We definitely want to talk about the recommendation for the 2023 year. We will also discuss the ADA compliance progress report and then really talk about the Supplement A and Supplement B discussions more thoroughly. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Adrian Karamihaus to walk us through this in a much more detailed manner. Next slide, please.
Good morning, everyone. So I am going to go through the superintendent's recommendation and then go into Supplement A and Supplement B. Mr. Adams will sort of be doing a little tag teaming. There are certain slides that he will be discussing, and I will go through some of the other ones. We did talk about the preliminary September 30th enrollment. Dr. McKnight noted that we are at 159,005 for this school year. That's the preliminary September 30th number. It is a one-year decrease of 59 students. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip through some of this since Dr. McKnight did go through it. Dr. McKnight did talk about as well, the school system enrollment is projected to increase to 160 by the 2027-2028 school year. That is a slight decline than we have seen in previous CIPs. One of it, of course, is due to COVID-19, but the other is due to lower kindergarten enrollments, and then smaller cohorts that are then going through the school system. For example, if you have a kindergarten class that is smaller than the 12th grade class that is leaving, your enrollment over that 6-year period will be lower. And so that's what we're seeing. We anticipate that kindergarten enrollment will change again in over the next couple of years. But right now, we are seeing a lower kindergarten than we are seeing a 12th grade leaving. Next slide, please. So here are slides that you have seen over the years. I'm actually going to put on my glasses so that I can see them as well. What we are looking at is the second to last column and the last column. That second to last column is that 1 year change. So the change from the previous actual enrollment from the 2020-2021 school year. And you can see there was an increase in kindergarten, but then you can see over the grades, this is a grade by grade, you can see that decline. So for example, the 1 year change in kindergarten is 484 students. So you can see, if you go just year by year, you can see those differences in the year by year. We always do see an increase in 9th grade. Partly it is because of a growth, partly it is because students coming from outside of MCPS from 8th grade into high school, and then also partly because of some students remaining in 9th grade based upon certain credits that they have to receive going from 9th grade to 10th grade. So that number is always a little bit higher. If you look at the last column, what we wanted to show here, though, is that growth in the grade by grade. So for example, again, you can see from grade to grade, so from kindergarten to first, you see an increase of 567 students. You can see the decline in each of those grades up until, again, 9th grade, where you have a pretty large bump, about 2,600 students. Again, for all the reasons that I said, there is a little bit of growth. It is kids coming into the school system in high school, and some of the kids remaining from 10th grade to get those extra credits they need to then be in 10th grade. Next slide, please. So here you could see just the numbers. Again, we're showing them just in different ways. We were on about 2,000 students over the course of probably about the last 10 years, on average, about 2,000 students coming into the school system. You can see in the 2020 school year that dropped pretty significantly to about 4,800 students. And as Dr. McKnight noted, that while we do see a decrease this year, that decrease is much less than we saw the year before. So it is a decrease of about 1,500 students. Next slide, please. Again, I talked about the birth rate, so you can see in this slide, this is something that we added. We haven't typically had this in our slides, but we wanted to show the decline. So you can see the decline in the births starting since 2011. It's a slow decline, but it is a decline. And then what happens with our kindergartens 5 years later. So you can see I did a line between 2016 and the 2021. You could see there were about 13,000 births, and we captured about 10,851 students of those births. So it's about 83%. Next slide. Again, this is also just showing where we are, another way to graph it. We are at an increase, though. If you're looking from 2011 to 2021, it's about an increase of 12,500 students. Again, with that decline, had we not had COVID and that significant decline, it would again be probably about 4,000 students more, since it's an average of about 2,000 a year. But we are, over that 10-year period, about 12,500 student increase. Next slide, please. And again, this is looking at it by grade, so elementary, middle, and high. Elementary is that blue line, middle school is the red line, and high school is the gray line. And you can see where we are now, which is about 67,836 elementary students, and this is K-5 only, does not include pre-K, so just want to be clear. At middle schools, you can see we're about 36,497 students, and high school, 50,912. And you can see in 2027, Those numbers changing, again, going from 67,000 to almost 69,600. At the middle school level, stays relatively the same, gains about 300 students or so. And at the high school, you see an increase of about 5,000 students. And we've talked about this for the past handful of years. We had that huge increase at elementary schools. Eventually, those elementary school kids become middle school students and then high school students. And so we're still seeing that growth at the high school level. Next slide, please. And this is our enrollment by race and ethnicity. Again, you can see the lines. I'll just start at the top. The green line is white, non-Hispanic. The purple line is our Hispanic students. The orange line is our African American students. The blue line, our Asian students. And then the last line is our 2 or more races. Again, that number did not start. You can see that line sort of starts in the middle when we started identifying the 2 or more races. So again, you can see where we are. We have, again, talked about this. The white non-Hispanic students have been declining over the past handful of years, whereas our Hispanic and African American students have been increasing over the past handful of years. And this just shows, again, that number, though, does represent all of our students in the school system. Next slide, please. And this is just another way to look at it. You can see the differences among the race ethnic groups, white students being at the bottom, then Hispanic students, African American, Asian, and then the 2 or more races at the top. Next slide. I think that may be it. And that is it. If there are any questions.
If you have any questions, please turn your light on. I'm not seeing any at this time, so you can continue.
Okay. So I will go right into, the, oh, I'm
Excuse
sorry.
me, Adrian,
I'm
Judy
sorry, I
didn't.
did have a question. Would you explain again about the 9th grade? Where are these students entering from? Do we know? Is it private school or?
So it's a combination. We've always said that. Maybe we can go back to that slide, that they are students. A lot of parents have their students in private school or parochial school for K through 8 and then come into our school system. We do, of course, have kids coming in all the time, but we always see that bump a little bit higher at the high school level, that they are entering for high school. Again, it's just growth, because we've talked about that there is growth at the high school level. We had it at the elementary schools, and then it is going through the grade levels from middle school to high school. And then the third, there is always that cohort of students that didn't quite make it into 10th grade. They may have been missing a couple of credits so that they remain in 9th grade, but as soon as they receive those credits, then go into 10th grade.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will dive into the interim superintendent's recommendation for the 23 to 28 CIP. Next slide, please. So Dr. McKnight did talk a little bit about this. We just want to give a little bit of background, sort of where we are and then where we're going to. So the adopted CIP was the Board of Education's requested CIP was $1.732 billion for the 6 years. It was $3.7 million more than the previously adopted CIP. The county council's adopted CIP for MCPS totaled $1.619 billion, which was a decrease of $112 million over that 6-year period. Of that decrease, about 68.4 was accelerated into a prior year, so it wasn't that the decrease was a total of 112.9 million, because they were able to accelerate some of those expenditures into a prior year. But it was a reduction of a true reduction of 44.5 million, which did result in reducing our countywide systemic projects, our roofs, HVAC, PLAR in the out years of the CIP. The county council was able to fund all the capital projects as requested by the board by assuming additional state aid through the Build to Learn Act, and they included typically in a year by year, it is what we receive from the state, which is what is included in that year. So for example, FY 2022, But last year, what the county council did was they included what was actually allocated to us from the state, but then on top of that, included an additional $23.8 million through the Build to Learn Act. So there was an assumption of state aid in FY22, which isn't typical of what the county council does year by year. Next slide, please. So here you can see it, it's just a graphical. The first line is the Board of Education's request in that top chart, that 1.731. The county executive's recommendation was the 1.678, which was a reduction of 53 million. And then the county council ultimately adopted 1.618, again, which was the $112 million reduction over the 6 years. And while it's important that they were able to accelerate some of those additional dollars, when you look at the bottom chart, it is about a 6-year total and where we've come from and where we're going to. So you can see starting in 2017, the 17 to 24 CIP, we were at 1.729. And then over the years, each, with the exception of that first year going up to 1.743 and then 1.77 billion, you start to see a reduction starting in 2019, year over year, from what was approved. So again, if you look at the 19 to 24 CIP, we're at 1.77 billion for the 6 years. The amended CIP was 1.744, which was a reduction of 33.5 million. From the 2019 to 24 amended CIP to the 2021-2026 CIP went down by 15.9 million to 1.728. And then again, from the 2021 to 26 CIP to the amended 21 to 26 CIP, it was another reduction of 109.2 million. So you can see that's where our baseline is, where we are beginning for the adopted, to go from the adopted CIP to the requested CIP. We're at 1.618 billion over the 6 years. Next slide, please. So how we fund the CIP, and we've talked about this over the years, the big funding source that we have are general obligation bonds. We do have state aid, we have impact tax, we have recordation tax, and of course we have current revenue. That current revenue does compete with the current revenue that is of course in the operating budget. But this slide is important because the GO bonds are such a large portion of our CIP, the county council every year does approve what bonds they're willing to spend. And so that is a big, if it gets reduced, it is a big impact on our CIP. So you can see from this slide, this is from the approved 22 CIP. Bonds represent 37% of our CIP. State aid, it was next at 25, but remember that 68 million that's showing has that assumption of 28 million. So it wouldn't be as large as it was in the past. School impact tax, about 9%. Recordation tax was high, it was about 23%. And the difference, just so that you know, between impact tax and the recordation tax, the impact tax is for new development. It's a tax that we receive that's on new development, and we get it all, the school system, MCPS. The recordation tax is a tax based upon existing homes that were sold. It is that tax that is sold. A portion of that goes to Montgomery College, a portion of that goes to us. Next slide, please. So again, when we talk about spending affordability guidelines, we talk about GO bonds. The County Council this past October 5th, adopted the spending affordability guidelines for the 23 to 28 CIP. It is for bonds, how much bonds they feel like they can afford to put in the CIP. The adopted SAG, it reduces bonds for the 6-year period by $90 million. And this reduction, as I said before, will have an impact on our construction program. And you can see from this chart, we were as high as $2 billion for the 6 years in that 2017 to 22 CIP, and then it starts to drop. We go from $2 billion to 1.86 to 1.77, and we are now down to 1.68 billion for the 6 years. So that's a pretty significant change over the course of about 5 years.
All right, next slide, please. So we're going to change gears a little bit and talk about other considerations that are associated with this recommended CIP. One of the dominating factors that you will start to see is, we are not necessarily, the superintendent is not necessarily recommending many more projects, but the cost of projects is going up. So the CIP number is going up, but there's not more projects there. And we want to walk you through the factors associated with this. This is a slide that we've presented a couple times. It's a graph from the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics. And you can see the blue line of the percentage change in construction costs. That's just looking at from a national perspective. And that represents, over a 20% increase. I would say that goes up until July. It did look promising as it was dipping down, but I can assure you it has gone back up, through our recent bidding experiences. The other important piece to this is not only is this a supply chain issue, it's also an impact of labor. Same as we're having conversations around difficulties finding, bus drivers, other school supports, teachers, the construction is impacted the same way. And certainly the costs that we're seeing are reflective of that. The other piece to this is that the timelines to get materials has drastically increased. I think we talked about water bottle filling stations taking 14, 15 weeks. Some of the air handling equipment that goes on our schools used to be a 3-month lead time. Now it's almost a year and 2 months. And one of the challenges that we're seeing is that we have not changed our completion dates. We haven't changed our durations. So we're starting to see some increased costs in just compacting work and seeing the different timelines. So while you're not going to see timeline changes in the CIP, I do think it's very important to talk about it because it is also part of the overall cost increases that we're seeing. Next slide, please. The next consideration is, as Adrian mentioned, the state aid portion. State aid is something that we've been talking about for decades, and I think there have obviously been large campaigns of making sure we have our fair share in Montgomery County. We actually now have the ability to pull from the Built to Learn Act funds. These Built to Learn Act funds were approved in that 2020 legislation. And essentially what that is it's a different type of revenue from the state that can be directed to school construction. So it's approximately a $2.2 billion program over 10 years. We are hearing that it might come down slightly because it is tied to everything from casino revenues to other aspects of the state that are also impacted by COVID. But our share is probably going to be in that 400 to 460 million range over that 10-year period. And the good news with this is that this portion is dedicated to Montgomery County. So this is not something we're competing with LEAs. This is a Montgomery County portion. And it is there to focus on aging infrastructure and new construction. Next slide, please. So while that is a good thing to have that money, as Adrian has said, there still is a cost share associated with it. So the Built to Learn Act money still is a 50% cost share. So meaning every $10 spent on a total project, 5 would come from the county, 5 from the state. So that does impact, or we will be impacted by the local economy and the local affordability as we look to utilize these funds. The other piece to this, and then Dr. McKnight mentioned it in her opening, and we've heard it from Adrian as well, is this notion of prevailing wage. The prevailing wage will be a requirement for these funds. These funds will be distributed by the Maryland Stadium Authority, and through their MOUs, draft MOUs, they have hinted that only projects that are bid using prevailing wage will be accepted into the program. You also look at the county council. There's current draft resolution for the county council to also have prevailing wage requirements in the county. So for us, while we've had the ability to stretch every dollar over the years, we will start to fall into prevailing wage costs. And those costs, what we've experienced on bid day over the last couple weeks, are up around 15% of total project costs. So they are not without cost, but I would say the benefit of being able to use these funds definitely warrants us moving in that prevailing wage direction. But there is a cost, and that cost is certainly represented in this overall CIP. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the recommendation, as I said, what you're going to see in this is it is an increase of $119.9 million over the previously approved. But most of that money is for existing pre-approved projects. So we have 7 previously approved capital projects that are reflected in the CIP that have associated inflation costs as well as prevailing wage premiums. And we will show you that breakout further along. We do have 2 new addition projects that is part of the recommendation, and they are Bartonsville and Greencastle Elementary Schools. Adrian will dive a little bit deeper into the justification behind those, but they are projects we have been talking about for 6+ years. They have they have seen some declines in enrollment, so they've come out of the CIP, but through the sort of that steady increase, it does make sense to look at these 2 projects and plan for addition projects. There are 2 major capital projects that have planning funding only, and they are Piney Branch Elementary and Eastern Middle School. They were talked about at the last CIP as hinting that they would be the next in line for major capital projects. So the recommendation does include planning funds, but it does not include construction funds. So I wanted to make sure I highlight that piece. And there are other countywide initiatives and countywide systemic projects that are created to address our aging infrastructure. We'll talk about them, everything from our sustainability initiatives to our emergency infrastructure plans, as well as highlight a few other initiatives, obviously around ADA, which we will talk about, and talk through some projects such as Wooten High School and site work, things that we've been talking about over the past year that are starting to be reflected in this recommendation. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to transition it over to Adrian to talk about the money portion of this.
So as the first recommendation is to keep all the individual projects on their scheduled completion date. Then we talk about the 7 projects that need additional funding in order to maintain their completion dates. So you can see from this slide what those projects are. It's Crown High School, the Joanne Lealick Elementary School of Broad Acres, the new 3-5 elementary school, Northwood High School, the new Woodward High School, and then there are 3 major capital projects, Neelsville Middle School, Damascus High School, and Wooten High School. And if you look at the first, it's sort of the second column where that first arrow is on the left, you could see what is in the approved CIP. What are those approved expenditures? So for example, for Crown High School, it's $136 million. That's what's in the approved CIP. Based upon what we just talked about, needing additional money for cost increases for construction, as well as for prevailing wage, if you look at that first Crown High School and look all the way now to the right at that second arrow, the new cost, the recommended cost for that project is $179 million. So we went from 136 to 179. You could see it's an increase of almost $43 million. Again, if you look sort of between the 2 bolded lines, the construction cost increases are about $23 million. And the prevailing wage increase, what we need to bid these projects as prevailing wage, is almost $20 million, is $19.5 million, again, for a total of $42 million. So that is how we wanted to show board members, show the public where we're getting those increases from. You can see for Joanne Lealick, the only cost increase is the prevailing wage. We do believe we have enough construction money to get through that project. That project the expenditures did come from when we reduced the the Silver Spring International Middle School scope in the last CIP. So we're comfortable right now that we have enough construction money, but we did have to account for prevailing wage. If you go down to Northwood, you could see Northwood does have both construction cost increases and prevailing wage. So does Woodward, Neelsville, and Damascus. When we look at Wooten, we did increase the cost for Wooten High School for their major capital project for $10 million. But right now, because it is not ready for bid, we are holding off just a little bit to see whether or not construction costs come down. And therefore, we may be able to incorporate the prevailing cost increase with the money that we're asking for right now. So again, you could see those increases, the revised costs, and you could see the total cost of those 7 projects. That's the circle. So just for all of the existing projects, those are existing projects, all approved in our CIP, we're asking for, the recommendation is $184.5 million to account for those construction cost increases and prevailing wage increases. And I know that you wanted to.
And we also wanted to just talk about a few of the projects on this list. There are 2 major new high school projects, Crown High School and Charles Woodward High School. We are currently in the community, or in the early stages of community engagement with Crown High School, and we have had ongoing conversations around Woodward High School. Both projects we will be bringing back to the board to discuss scope, to discuss program. For the Woodward project, I know you have seen quite a bit around, which concept, which approach will we take as a school district around their fields. We are still, again, very early in that process. We've started to share with community members. We're going to go out to the DCC community. We're going to go to, obviously, the WJ community to bring back as much of that feedback in order for you to make an informed decision around those fields. But this does represent funding of a full complement of athletic facilities. We've really tried to look at this as a comprehensive approach to make sure that we have enough funding to do that. And should we end up going down a direction that would increase costs, we'll certainly flag that at a future board meeting. But at this time, we feel confident that we can provide, all those amenities at both Crown High School as well as Woodward High School within the funding that we have, without necessarily bringing to you a decision today or within this recommendation on a full concept. So I just wanted to flag those 2 projects. Next slide, please.
So the third sort of set of recommendations that we talked about was for 2 new individual projects. This is for Burtonsville Elementary School and Greencastle, and as Seth alluded to, these projects have actually been in and out of the CIP for a number of years. And the reason why they were taken out is because we do have that 92-seat threshold for enrollment, and so they just fell underneath, and then they sort of came back again. And the reason why we're putting them in now, and you can see those 2 charts below, is that while their numbers sort of move a little bit up and down, they still stay way above what that 92-seat threshold is. These schools also are both class size reduction schools, and Greencastle is a Title I school. So with all of that into play, and you can see the capacity at Burtonsville, it's a smaller school. It's about 493. And it will be overutilized by about 126 students over the 6 years in that last year of the CIP. Greencastle is a little larger. It's at 591, about 100 seats larger, but it will be actually more overutilized, about 152 students in the last year of the CIP. So taking all of that into account, their class size reduction, Title I for Greencastle, both the schools are recommended for full funding, both planning and construction for additions at their schools with completion dates of 2025, August of 2025. Next slide.
And so these, again, are the 2 projects within the major capital project program, being Piney Branch Elementary and Eastern Middle School. As you can see, we are only including planning funds to start in FY23 through obviously FY25. Middle school projects are typically a 2-year process. Elementary school is 18 months, but certainly we are looking to continue those expenditures over that 2-year time period. The important piece to this is that we are not recommending construction funds at this time. I would remind everyone the Major Capital Project Program was intended to not continue the RevX Revitalization Expansion Program of assuming a complete tear down and rebuild for each project. So we feel it's very important to go through the design, to really vet design options with the community and come back to the board with a very good recommendation on construction without necessarily bringing those numbers to you today without vetting that process. But I wanted to flag that because I know there seem to be some confusion in the community, or there's been certain expectations in the community that every project within the Major Capital Program will be similar to what we've experienced in our past revitalization expansion program. Next slide, please. A few of the new countywide programs here. You see the early childhood centers, the emergency replacement for major building components, the material management building relocation, and sustainability initiatives. These are 4 critical projects for us. The early childhood center being certainly tied to some of those ideas around Kirwan Commission, the Blueprint for Maryland. I would remind everyone that the Up-County early education program is going to be relocated to Watkins Mill High School over this winter break. That was a project that we had recommended. The board requested to the county council. Was ultimately removed. But we are making that work within Watkins Mill High School at this time. But these funds would allow for a permanent structure to be built alongside at Watkins Mill High School for that program. So again, I think this is a great project to highlight in terms of when projects are removed or not approved through the county executive, through the county council process, it has direct impacts on our schools and our students. This one we're making it work with, and the Watkins Mill community is rallying behind this project. But again, it would be a much different picture if those funds were still in the CIP. So this is a request to build that back in, as well as start to identify future sites and begin some of that feasibility study to expand that program beyond just the Watkins Mill High School. The emergency replacement of major building components. This is an important one for a variety of reasons, but one of the main reasons is when we have large equipment that fails, it typically there are no funds in our maintenance and our operating costs to typically replace some of those big items. And so what typically happens is obviously those emergency repairs compete with our planned HVAC replacement, compete with our other systemic replacement programs, and we typically have planning and other expectation challenges associated with that. So with this program, the goal is to have funds that are dedicated to this emergency replacement of major equipment. This is equipment that does fit within the capital program. Again, we definitely do not want necessarily to fund major chiller replacements or major electrical component replacements out of the operating budget. So this is a new program that we could pull from to fund those issues as they come up. Look, we certainly, this is hopefully something that can be planned. But we know with 208 facilities at over, I guess we're getting close to 28 million square feet, things happen, emergencies happen, and this would allow us to be able to respond without impacting some of our planned projects. The next one is the material management building relocation. So this is an important one, and I know Jeannie's probably smiling through her mask here for this one, living in the Stone Street building. But when you think about a school district of our size, materials management and that process of how we do everything from deliveries to how we store things, how we just respond to our schools, we need to have space that is more reflective of our size and our school district needs. Stone Street facility is not that. It is getting close to 100 years old. And our staff have done everything they can in their power to keep things moving, but this is a much-needed project. It's a much-needed project for us as a school district, but I would also say it's a much-needed project to move off the Stone Street site. And again, reflect on what our presentation was a few months ago around how we need to change our approach to facilities, how we need to understand our impacts on communities. And that Stone Street facility in Lincoln Park is definitely one of those facilities we would want to focus on.
Mr. Adams, if I may, for just a moment, thank you so much for elevating that. I believe we had a few board members who had an opportunity to go out and visit Stone Street over the past year, and that has been a facility that I must say, this has been a conversation internally that's been one that's gone on for a long period of time. I know we oftentimes talk about as we move into planning for our school system as a result of COVID-19, Mr. Adams could not have elevated that point even more about how we want to think about how we plan and coordinate these facilities out of the traditional way that we have done them over the years. I mean, there are all types of companies that we're learning from that are really thinking about storage space and how they do it in so many different ways that is user-friendly, environment-friendly, all of those ways. And we think it's a natural opportunity for us to really focus on that as we move into a new era of just rethinking about how we plan for those facilities. So I just wanted to bring that forward because I know some of you would be able to connect with that personally, having visited the Stone Street area and seeing how significant the need is. And quite frankly, it has been such a significant need over time. So thank you, Mr. Adams, for elevating that one because it is truly a...
Yeah, I can't thank you enough for elevating that place. It's drafty, it's big. You still have Quonset huts over there. Anybody remember those from the Second World War? It's really needed. I have to commend the people who work there, who've done such an efficient job, and we thank them for that.
So yes, that's a critical project and one that, it is competing with capital dollars, but again, when you put it in context of its place as a school district resource, it definitely needs attention and needs to be elevated. The last item on here is our sustainability initiatives, and I know we've talked about this, and the board is preparing for a policy change around sustainability. This is a program that would allow for us to respond, would allow for us to start to focus on everything from solar on rooftops, possibly parking lots, looking for ways to tie in program improvements, everything. We've thrown those concepts of around sustainable agriculture programs to different types of connection points for students, outdoor education, you name it. So this is an initiative that is tied obviously to our new Sustainability and Compliance Division, but also one that I believe will dovetail very nicely into the board's future policy discussions on this. All right, next slide. And sticking with the key or the theme of major capital projects, one of the ideas that we've talked about and had some great conversations with Dr. McKnight over the past several months is this idea that the major capital projects are not just a continuation of our previous revitalization expansion program. And the goal with these projects is to focus on the highest need infrastructure, focus on the highest need capacity and program challenges at each one of these schools and respond accordingly. So one of the things that we would like to do and we are recommending is that we actually go through a feasibility process to work with the community on scope building. So really walking through each one of these buildings with the community and then ultimately coming back with the Board of Education a very established scope of work and corresponding budget. So these are the schools that have ranked the highest on the KFI list, have ranked the highest on the state assessment list, and ones I think many of you probably have visited and certainly have your own opinions of these buildings, but certainly one that we feel a need to go through a process and really fully vet it so that we can come back with a very established scope of work. All right, next slide, please. So just on that one, there is money, a money increase associated with those feasibility studies. It's not much, but it is within one of our programs. That's why we really wanted to highlight that. There are some non-capital recommendations within this program as well. And I'm going to transition it over to Adrienne because she will speak much more better at this than I can.
So we have 3 true non-capitals, of course, Supplement A and Supplement B, which we're going to get to next. But then we have Clarksburg Cluster Elementary School number 9. So it is scheduled to open in 2023. We need to create a new service area for that elementary school. And so the recommendation for the scope of the boundary study from Dr. McKnight is to include Clarksburg Elementary School, Gibbs Elementary School, Little Bennett, and Wilson Wims Elementary School. So those 4 elementary schools to be included in the boundary study. No middle schools or high schools are being recommended in the scope of the boundary study. And then based on the completion date of the new elementary school, again, which is August 2023, the recommendation is to conduct the boundary study this spring 2022, with Board of Education action in November of 2022, so that the boundary study will be set, the service area will be set, and for opening in August of 2023. Next slide, please.
Can I ask a quick question? Sure.
So again, we just want to show just sort of a recap, the approved versus the recommended CIP. So again, the approved CIP is $1.618 billion over the 6 years. We are now in, of course, FY22. The recommended CIP is $1.738 billion over the 6-year CIP between 2023 and 2028. We always talk about that the CIP is a biennial CIP process. The focus is always more on the first 2 years and then the 6-year total. So again, the 6-year total is an increase of $119.4 million. Again, much of that is attributed to the increases that we need for construction costs and for prevailing wage. But I want to focus here is the first 2 years. So if you look at the FY21, the top chart, it's $257.6 million. That's the expenditures for FY21, which was the first year of the last 6-year CIP. When we are looking at the recommended CIP for FY23, it's $361.4 million, which is an increase of $103.7 million for the first year, comparing first year's approved versus first year recommended. If you look at FY 2022, again, that first chart is 278.9. The recommendation for 2024, which is the second year, is 425, almost 0.8 million. That's an increase of 146.8 million. Again, comparing second year to second year. Those are pretty significant increases for first year and second year. However, we want to make the point again is that there are very few new initiatives, and those new initiatives, if you look at the first and even the second years, those are nominal monies for, let's say, for Burtonsville and Greencastle. We're talking about only planning dollars. Even with the other new initiatives, we're talking about very small increases. Again, what those increases really represent are expenditures in the approved CIP for already approved projects. So this is just their expenditure schedule moving along in a 6-year CIP. It's very little increases as a result of new projects.
And I would say this is a very important slide for our future discussions, particularly with the county executive and county council. Within these first 2 years, as Adrienne pointed out, we actually will have many projects under contract. So we'll have our four elementary school major capital projects. We will have the Clarksburg number 9 project. We will have Poolesville High School, and then obviously the Woodward Phase 1 under contract within these expenditures. The only projects that will not be to bid ultimately when this makes it through the county council discussions and deliberations are Northwood, Neelsville, Woodward Phase 2, and Crown High School. And while that's important is that the projects that will be coming before you for contract approval, there really is no stopping a project once it's in construction. That's just something that I don't think has ever happened before. But you can see there is a significant difference between what the county has been able to afford and our ultimately approved current expenditure schedules associated with these projects. So this is definitely something that we will continue to keep bringing back to you all, but it does seem that there appears to be a downward trend in affordability from a county perspective, and obviously an upward trend in construction costs. And the two of them are certainly on a path where we will have to have those discussions. But I just wanted to flag that there will be many, many projects already under construction by the time the county executive and county council ultimately get to a point of discussion around 23 and 24. And those approved projects are in these expenditure years. So with that, I think that's our last slide, and we can go to the next slide and open it up for discussion.
Thank you. Please put your light on if you have a question. I just want to remind you that this is the superintendent's recommendation, and you should ask clarifying questions, but we will be holding a work session on these for in-depth questions. So I'm going to start with Ms. Mandrowski.
Yep, just a quick clarifying question. For the Clarksburg Elementary School number 9, why are there no middle schools or high schools? These recommended schools don't all articulate to the same middle school, so would that mean that Clarksburg Elementary School will be a split articulation elementary school?
So do you mean the existing Clarksburg Elementary or the new?
The new one.
So we don't know yet based upon what the recommendation will be. Currently, Clarksburg Elementary School is a split articulated because some of the kids go to Neelsville and then Seneca Valley, and then some go to Rocky Hill and Clarksburg High School. So Gibbs, for example, is already a split articulated elementary school. And so it's either Little Bennett, I have to look. So some of them are already split. So not including the middle schools and high schools was an okay decision, or it was a decision that we talked about and thought about, but they are already split articulated schools.
Okay.
And, yeah. And
Like Wilson Wims goes to Hallie Wells and.
right, that one is split actually the other way. And I can tell you, let me just confirm which one. Just so I don't misspeak. So Gibbs is already split articulated. Clarksburg Elementary School is already split articulated. Wims actually is the only one. Wilson Wims goes actually to Hallie Wells and Clarksburg High School. It is not split articulated. And Little Bennett goes to Rocky Hill and Clarksburg. So this area is actually a mixture of those three middle schools, which would be Neelsville, Rocky Hill, and Hallie Wells.
Okay. I have to process this a little bit because it doesn't make sense.
Ms. Silvestri.
Yes, in the last slide that you presented, you stated that some of these projects are already under contract, so funding needs to be there to pay for them. And then Northwood, Neelsville, Crown are in the approved CIP is my point, I guess, right? So it is expected that these projects will be funded and that we will be moved. That's what an approval means. Yes, under normal circumstances?
So the previous approvals, however, did not include the increase of inflation and prevailing wage. The one thing I would also, I was remiss on talking about on that first one is the DeFeef project transition to fund those other 5 or 6 schools. That's currently in process with the county council at the moment. It's not reflected. I don't think that transfer is reflected in this. So ultimately, if they approve it, we can update the values here. So I guess my point to that is that we have found ways to fund the inflation side of many of these projects, where there still will be a prevailing wage piece that we will have to talk through at some point in the next several weeks as we move forward. But to your point, we have figured out ways to continue these projects within our own means, particularly with those 6 that the FIF has ultimately funded. As we transition further, we will have to rely on the county council to fund any increases associated with prevailing wage, or also continue to fund the projects that were previously approved on their previously approved schedules. So there's a lot here to unpack, but I think, the theme of that slide is that costs have gone up. We, as a school district, really would prefer, and through the superintendent's recommendation, are recommending all those projects stay on their current schedule, but there will be some serious funding discussions that will need to take place with the county executive and county council in order to maintain those completion timelines.
And then your slide about the CIP, it got up to $2 billion in FY 17-22, and then that was the recession, right? When it started to go down. 2018 was the recession. No, 2008 was a recession. So no, never mind, not that. So I guess just big picture, just trying to understand. We've always had a triple bond rating in the county, correct? And so, what has caused this decrease in CIP if we've always maintained a triple bond rating even when we were funding it at the $2 billion level?
So I think, so if you're talking about the spending affordability guidelines, when the county looks to approve spending affordability, they have their own criteria. One of them, of course, is to maintain AAA bond rating. It's also to look at the percentage of debt service at the overall operating budget. And the debt service is what pays for those bonds. I always say it's like a mortgage. You're paying off every month, every year in the 6 years. You're paying off in that year the debt that those bonds, the purchase of those bonds require. We purchase them, then we pay them off, just like a mortgage. And so that debt service over time has become larger and larger. It has become a bigger percentage of the overall operating budget. It is now the biggest, when I showed that slide that showed where our funding sources and the divide, if you think about the operating budget in that way, the debt service has become the biggest portion of the county's operating budget. And so that is something that they look at over time, and that's something that they want to get down. And the only way to get down that debt service is to make the spending affordability lower. That's just, that's the connection between the two.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Harris?
Thank you. First question I have builds on, I think, Ms. Silvestri. So we're looking at, I think we're lucky in Montgomery County. We have some really smart budget people like Rich Medellino. But we're looking at spending affordability guidelines, which can fluctuate based on the county's comfort with bonding more and debt service, as you were just mentioning, and also market fluctuations. So when we're looking at this planning, can you just talk about how, if the markets stabilize, if the inflationary pressures come down a bit, will we be having another conversation about maybe having a little more space in the CIP, say next year or the year after?
So I think the answer is yes, right? So if the market comes down and you've previously approved higher than expected budgets, there would be more room to do more projects at that point. I would, though, just caution that some of our supply chain issues are real and anticipating to subside at some point. Labor, on the other hand, I think that is a cautionary tale that we all are looking at and may continue for years to come. So certainly something we will be talking through. But a big part too of Adrian's discussions around this debt service, though, is that the timing of Built to Learn funds and the fact that there is a 10-year window on those, and that we don't want to be the last LEA in the state to take advantage of Built to Learn funds. So I think there are some pressures to be able to fund, some portions of our CIP to be able to respond to Built to Learn. I think the timing of Built to Learn is a tough one, certainly as the county is trying to lower their overall bonds and the debt service, but I think it's real, and it's one that we're going to have to talk through, and we will be part of that discussion with the county in terms of how to fund this, and what does it compete against? Does it compete against projects like the Purple Line? Does it compete against other major transit projects that are in the county?
And I just want to add one more thing when we're looking at, if and when construction, whether those prices come down at all, whether we're able to use any of those dollars. The prevailing wage, though, is one that is different because our approved CIP does not include the prevailing wage. So when I showed that chart about construction and prevailing wage, we did it specifically so you could see what those increases are due to construction, but what those increases are due to prevailing wage. And that won't change. So as we get closer to those projects that we're ready to bid, we have to look to see whether or not, those projects do include or can take on the prevailing wage. If not, they would have to be increased as well. And I think the one I gave was Wooten, where we increased the cost, but we didn't increase for prevailing wage because we don't know where we'll be in about a year or two, but it's very possible that there are projects included in the adopted CIP that we will have to take a second look at to adjust for prevailing wage in the future.
Thank you. And I would just mention that, we just finished our county's quadrennial review of, we used to call it subdivision staging, now we're calling county growth policy. But the next review will happen, we're in the middle of this 6-year cycle, and I guess there is also an opportunity to make some changes to school impact taxes. So, clarifying question, the Greencastle Burtonsville, it may be too early to answer these questions definitively, I'm hearing from the community. Would the expansions for Greencastle and Burtonsville include increasing the cafeteria space, that multi-purpose space?
So yes, we actually had some preliminary conversations on both of these projects in the past, and I know the Burtonsville project, that initial project scope that existed, I think 5 or 6 years ago, did include a cafeteria expansion as well as improvements on the site to make that a much safer pedestrian and walking and just navigation-friendly site. Greencastle, yes, Greencastle, I would also remind folks that it's a repeat school, so Greencastle is the same one as Waters Landing. It's the same one as McNair, all projects that we've just recently either have gone through construction or have brought to you as a preliminary plan. So you can sort of probably expect a similar approach to the Greencastle project as what we have seen on those 2 previous projects.
Okay.
But core is a big part of the work and making sure, particularly, and I have to say this, a Title I school and understanding its impacts of both breakfast and lunch and meals beyond that is a big part of our work in that school.
Okay. And another question from the community I'm hearing is, will there be increased space in those expansions for pre-K?
So typically what we do is we always look, first of all, if they have pre-K, and if they don't, then we would consider building a classroom. We would, depending on the scope of the work, depending on what they currently have, if they currently have kindergarten rooms, but we need more, we would add an additional one for pre-K, or they would use their existing, and then we would build new kindergarten. So it just depends when we start looking at the school what the need is, but we typically look to build at least one pre-K if they do not have.
And a third question, I'm sure you've heard this too, that I'm hearing is, what would be the cost comparison between these 2 RevX projects or just building a new school on the Bentley Park site?
And that's a good question. One actually in a co-location discussion with the county recently, there was discussion around, the Burtonsville Elementary School site and understanding that it's not in a walking area, right? So the community that it serves cannot walk to that school. So is there an idea that, versus making investment in addition and site improvements, would it make more sense to look at off-site? I think the challenge is that if you add up both school capacities, it exceeds, what you could fit into one school. But certainly, we will be continuing to look at that Burtonsville issue to see if a relocation, a land swap or something makes more sense. But for now, we are just planning for additions at both schools.
Okay. And then a question I have from folks very happy about the Piney Branch and Eastern coming on, and it's probably too early to answer. The scope of those projects, do we think we'll be needing holding schools?
So typically for an elementary school, yes. And particularly Piney Branch, that is our smallest school site. It really isn't probably impossible to build with students on site. So yes, on the middle school, no, though I think we have some really innovative ideas to build on site. And I would also just caution for an Eastern as well is that we shouldn't assume a full tear down. I mean, we're going to walk through that scope and make sure we can build that the right way, but also look for opportunities to build while students are on site as well. So, you mentioned RevX. These are not RevX, major capital projects. So our last RevX was Seneca Valley High School, and we have transitioned on to the major capital projects.
Sorry. And a clarifying question just for me, when you talked about moving the Early Childhood Center to Watkins Mill, is the vision there to build actually new space for them next to the high school?
Correct. So right now we're using Watkins Mill High School space to accommodate, and this recommendation is to build a standalone and give Watkins Mill High School their space back.
Okay. And next thing, I just want to thank you for including here specific funding for the sustainability initiatives. I think we spend money on things that we value, and that I think is important for the school system. A question that comes out of the Poolsville cluster meeting we had in Clarksburg number 9 service area doing that study. I'm just going to ask because we were asked by the Monocacy community, any chance that this would provide an opportunity to maybe send some of those students from the Clarksburg cluster to Monocacy Elementary?
So Dr. McKnight's recommendation is to include only those 4 elementary schools. We did talk about Monocacy. One of the issues is that there is no space. I mean, they do have like 50 seats available. So you're looking that if you were to put students there, then you would have to either move students out or possibly a capital solution in order to then have more students there. The other issue, which actually Ms. Smondrowski brought up, middle schools and high schools. So of course, if we were to reassign students to Monocacy, then one of the issues is that you have a very small amount of students that were then reassigned. If no middle schools and high schools are included, that very small group of students would then go back to their middle schools and high schools and not continue on at Poole and Poolsville.
Yeah.
And so for those reasons, we did discuss it, and we discussed it at length. It was not recommended. What we did talk about, though, in the future, as you know, we're looking at Damascus High School to accommodate future growth from Clarksburg. We are building Damascus much larger. And at that point, there is an opportunity to sort of look at that upper part of the county, Poolsville, Clarksburg, and Damascus, and see what can be done at that point. But this was a very specific, and the idea of moving just a small group of kids and then having them not continue with their cohort to middle school and high school, but that very small, was something that we didn't recommend. Usually when we have split articulated elementary schools, middle and high schools, you're looking at sort of a 50-50 split, 60-40. There are a few exceptions to that. Some of them are walkers, and so you kept them in their school. But the idea of having a larger cohort or group of students be able to continue on with their group, and that wouldn't have been possible in that scenario.
Yeah. And last question goes back also something that came up at the Poolsville cluster meeting. And Mr. Adams, you mentioned that in bidding the project, the Poolsville High School project, we're bidding that in pieces because of the current market pressures. Is that a strategy that we might be using at some of these other capital projects that are coming online?
Possibly in the future. I think Poolsville presented itself as an opportunity because it was going to take several years to complete. The challenge with our other elementary schools is they are a pretty small window, 18-month construction window, so there's not many opportunities to move different pieces around on those particular projects. But certainly when we get to projects like Crown, should there be some funding challenges with the county, we can get creative and look at different ways to keep momentum going, but not necessarily have to pay for the entire project up front. But that is certainly a concept we want to continue to explore at our middle and high schools to keep things moving within the CIP versus just see things stop.
Well, thank you very much for all of this.
All right, thank you, Mr. Adams. Would you like to continue?
Sure. So we will, for the next slide, if we can bring up the presentation. This is the ADA compliance progress report. I believe in June, the board passed a resolution that at both the fall and spring CIP discussion timelines that we would come back with a progress report. So for this one, we thought it was a good idea to walk through with the board the transition planning and identify the work that the consultant has done and how we've responded as a school district. So if we go to the next slide. There's a lot of material in these slides, so I'm not going to read these, but certainly I think for those that are interested in ADA compliance, this is a really good resource to go to and just understand where ultimately we are coming from as a school district. But you can see, through the work of the consultant, they looked at it and started to identify priorities. And when you think about the priorities, the priority one being, can you actually even get into the building? I mean, that is obviously priority one. And then for us, we really worked with them to make sure that they had our programs and our services for our students as the next priority. That doesn't necessarily fit within the DOJ guidelines, but for us as a school district, that is the highest priority. And then you can see where some of these other amenities come in. I would just say you've probably heard of the DOJ involvement in some of our past high school projects. That was a very limited scope. That was a scope focused more on voting than it was for school operations. And all of the work that was associated with those projects, I believe it was back in 2010, 2012 timeline was completed. But that work is very separate than what we are talking about within our assessment and our work as a school district around ADA. Next slide. And again, a part of the compliance strategy is again to create a transition plan. And this does come directly from DOJ in terms of, you identify the issues and then you ultimately start to identify a transition plan. Historically, our compliance strategy was obviously to focus on specific areas that were challenging for students and staff, and that was through dialogue, it was through assessment, it was through communications. The large compliance issues were ultimately resolved in our major projects like the RevX project, addition projects, those types of approaches. But as we transition into compliance, they will still exist, and they have to exist as a school district for us to be able to meet these needs. But we're also going to transition into standalone ADA projects as well. We've had smaller scale projects over the years, but I would say 90+% were always incorporated into other projects such as restroom renovations and others. We are going to transition into pure compliance projects. Some of these projects may not, they will be purely based on facility improvements, not necessarily on responses from community schools. They're going to be focused solely on the issues identified or the barriers identified by the study. So this is part of Dr. McKnight's recommendation, is to increase the ADA program to start to transition into this area. But also I wanted to just point out that we will continue the ADA approach as we have historically, through our major capital projects and through, those communications and identifications of barriers, but we are transitioning beyond that as well. Next slide. So again, from an approach standpoint, this recommendation includes a $13.6 million increase in the ADA program. It also, again, acknowledges the fact that there is quite a few components of ADA compliance happening in other areas of the CIP. So it's not just the 13.6 plus what was there before, but it is it's every one of our major capital projects. When I go back and look at our reports, every one of our major capital projects that we are about to construct had major compliance challenges, so we've certainly resolved many of them through those projects. But again, this standalone 13.6 will include specific projects, as you see up here: Clarksburg, Forest Knolls, Germantown, Laytonsville, Meadow Hall, Oakview, Ritchie Park Elementary Schools, schools that are not on this list, Ridgeview Middle and their entrance. So there's some very specific projects that we have identified as ADA standalone projects that will be a part of this recommendation. Another big part of this is the creation of an ADA compliance coordinator position, and we have the ability to do that within the capital program. If it has ties to capital, it does not have to reside in the operating; it can reside in the capital budget. So part of this 13.6 is the creation of this position. That would obviously partner very closely with the county's compliance coordinator, but one we think is important to continue successfully through our transition plan. And then the last piece is that the Wooten High School, we've talked about that project many times. And while we can't necessarily move the entire project, we are looking at a recommendation to shift some of the expenditures around to be able to tackle some of the outside work first. Which we know the outside of that site it poses challenges both from a safety security as well as an ADA compliance standard. So that is a part of this work. Next slide. I think that is the discussion. So again, for this one, we wanted to just give you an update of where we are and why we're where we are. And as we continue through this work, these progress reports, I think, will certainly change over time, and where we're talking about specific projects, specific scopes, as well as what has been completed and what is in line to be completed next. But for now, we wanted to just start out as showing from a level set standpoint and show us where we're starting.
Thank you. I know you didn't come to fully discuss this today. I just have one question. You said in 2010 DOJ made some changes, some accessibility alterations for voting. Did I understand you correctly?
Yeah, so there was an issue raised with the Department of Justice back in the probably that 2008-2009 timeframe, and they came out and did an assessment of our schools from a voting lens. It was not from a school district lens. And every one of the barriers that they identified through that assessment we had completed. I just thought it was important to flag that because I think some of our community members think that DOJ review was for something else. But it was very specific to the fact that our schools are used as voting centers, and that there were some challenges identified to them, barriers identified to them that they investigated at that time.
Thank you. I just wanted to be clear I understood that. Ms. Harris?
Just two quick questions. So the ADA compliance coordinator, that's good. Do we have a sense of what kind of qualifications for somebody that would do that work?
Well, so I think as a job description goes, it would definitely be someone with an architectural background. But ideally for a school district, it's not just architecture, it's an understanding of the academic needs of students as well. So to be able to tie that building element into an understanding of school design and school operations was going to be really important for us. But typically, ADA coordinators have a form of architectural background, engineering background that we would focus on.
Okay. And just to clarify, the list of ADA projects and the status, is that still on the website?
Yes, our website has every school. If you click on the school name, it brings up the entire report of each school. And we've, similar to the KFIs, we have identified them with schools that have some barriers identified, but not as significant or high priority as some others. So we've identified indoor, outdoor type of barriers on that website, so folks can see what the assessment shows from just a Cliff Note version as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. You can continue.
All right, we are going to transition into the supplements around the boundary studies. So with that, Adrian?
Yes, so next slide, please. So this is the first boundary study that we are going to be reviewing. It is Supplement A. It's for to create the new service area for Gaithersburg Elementary School number 8. This boundary study scope was adopted in 2019. It included all of the cluster elementary schools that you can see here: Gaithersburg, Rosemont, Goshen, Strawberry Knoll, Laytonsville, Summit Hall, and Washington Grove. It also included the two middle schools in the Gaithersburg cluster, both Forest Oak and Gaithersburg, to review the middle school articulation patterns. The original scope of, or the original schedule, if you recall, we were asked, the board asked us to conduct it a little bit earlier than typical. The community had asked for that, so we did start it in spring 2020, and the report was to be issued in the fall of 2020. We did start it in March 2020 with the first set of meetings, and actually those were in person. And then unfortunately, we had to suspend due to COVID in March 2020. So we only got those first set of meetings conducted. And then we did resume in October of 2020. Of course, all of them were held virtually. And we completed all of the community meetings in December of 2020. Because of that delay, the board did ask us to come back and share the report that we typically just have, that we submit and put online, but we actually shared and had a presentation to the board in March of 2021. So this past March, we shared that report, and then of course the superintendent released the recommendation in October. Next slide, please. So these are the two service areas. This is the Gaithersburg service area. The one on the left shows the elementary school service areas and their designation, and on the right is the middle schools. So if I start at the top, the large sort of periwinkle is Laytonsville. Right underneath it in yellow or gold is Goshen. Right underneath it in pink is Strawberry Knoll. Right underneath that is sort of a teal color is Gaithersburg Elementary School. To the right, sort of the greenish color, is Washington Grove. The red or darker pink color is Rosemont. And then to the left of that, or right underneath and to the left, is Summit Hall. So you have all of those service areas. Those are all of the elementary school service areas. To the right are the middle school service areas. The green is Forest Oak, and the reddish color is Gaithersburg Middle. So you could see how the service areas are divided among the elementary schools that are then to articulate to the middle schools. Next slide. So back when we started the boundary study, we were using official 19 to 20 enrollment numbers. Those are the official 19 to 20 school year numbers, and then we were using the projections from 2021 through the 2025 CIP. You can see what I've done is circled the overutilizations at some of the schools. So for example, Gaithersburg Elementary School in the last year was 146 students over. Rosemont was 103. Strawberry Knoll was 223 over, and Washington Grove, Summit Hall was 247 students over. And you can see that if you add up those numbers, certainly those are numbers that would add up to a new elementary school. But if you think back, just the one slide, to the service areas a little bit, it has a real center, which are those lower schools, Gaithersburg, Washington Grove, Summit Hall, and Rosemont, and then you have the two schools, Goshen and Laytonsville, that then sort of form that sort of handle or top part of the service area. Next slide, please. And this is the middle schools, again, the projections. The middle schools were included, again, to look at the articulation patterns. We weren't looking to, in the end, depending on what the recommendation is and what the options were, it did change some of course, the demographics and the utilization, but we were looking really at the articulation patterns. And you can see that the schools are somewhat similar as far as utilization. Forest Oak is a little over at 21, and this was, again, the numbers that we were using. And Gaithersburg has about 50 seats available, or had 50 seats available. Next slide. And this is the demographic data, the racial ethnic composition, again, back in 2019 and 20, which is what we used to do the staff-developed options. If you look at the second to last column, something that we look at is the farms percentage. You can see Gaithersburg Elementary School has 85% farms. Summit Hall is I think, 79.8% farms. And then you can see the changes, the different farms percentages among those elementary schools. Forest Oak, the middle schools, you can see Forest Oak had 57.1% farms. Gaithersburg Middle School at 44.7% farms. And this is all of the racial and ethnic data that we use to develop the options. Next slide. So stakeholder input. We do have community meetings. This is written right in our policy in FAA. So we have community meetings. We get input through those meetings. We get input through surveys that we have. But in this particular instance, we did have a set of 4 meetings, so 8 meetings total for the boundary study. The initial intent was to conduct each of those sets at the 2 middle schools so that people can come. They were in close proximity to their homes. So one was going to be at Forest Oak, one set at Forest Oak, and the other set at Gaithersburg Middle School. Unfortunately, again, due to COVID, after the first set of meetings, they were all held virtually. We did have a Spanish interpreter at all of our meetings, at all the virtual meetings, so that if there were any questions, they could be posted in the Q&A and can be asked and answered with that Spanish interpreter. Next slide, please. Once we did resume the meetings in October, again, they were held virtually. All written information presented was available in both English and in Spanish and posted on our website. A link was included as well because the new Gaithersburg number 8 elementary school is in the city of Gaithersburg, so they posted all of our information through a link. So if any community members were interested, they could go on the city of Gaithersburg website and then find all the information on our website. For the first set of the options meetings, staff presented 4 options for stakeholders to consider. The first presentation was recorded and was posted as a YouTube link on our website. Spanish interpretation was available after that live presentation through the YouTube link. Stakeholders that were unable to attend that first meeting were encouraged to view the recording because then we had 2 separate meetings. One, there were strictly Q&As, so anybody can come and ask any question regarding the options. One was held in Spanish, one was held in English. And then a second round of options were developed, and the format was exactly the same. We had a presentation. That presentation was recorded. It was on the YouTube link. And then we had a second set of Q&As, again, one in English and one in Spanish, to answer any questions on those staff-developed options. Next slide, please. To broaden our outreach with the Hispanic and Latino community, we collaborated with staff in the Office of Student and Family Support and Engagement and Identity, who we have engaged in the past. We held an additional meeting. Actually, there were two meetings, one with Gaithersburg Elementary and Middle School parents, and it was a more targeted focus group meeting. And the second one actually was with Gaithersburg High School, and we had another set of parents there. We did have actually really good turnout. There were about 30 participants. Parents and or guardians asked questions in Spanish. We were able to answer all of those questions in Spanish as well. We didn't go dive deep into the options because we didn't have we didn't have a lot of time. So what we did was we just presented the options in general, but what we really did focus on were the factors, because that always is, the questions. So we talked about geography, we talked about utilization, we talked about the race ethnic composition of the schools based upon those staff-developed options. We presented what the next steps were and how community members can get involved. Some people wanted to give feedback. We let them know how they give feedback through our public information, through our public hearings, through the board's public hearings, as well as being able to send emails or even phone calls to the board to let them know, or the superintendent to let them know their thoughts on those options or what was important to them based upon those four factors: geography, our geography, utilization, and our race ethnic composition of our students. Again, we presented those both in Spanish and which we do believe absolutely encourage participation, being able to ask those questions in Spanish and being able to answer those questions in Spanish as well. Next slide, please. In March 2021, as I previously stated, the report was presented to the Board of Education. At that meeting, board members did ask us to hold another set of meetings at the schools. So we did that between April and May. We had one meeting per school for at the schools that were, those elementary schools that were affected by the staff-developed options. We worked with the school administration. We sent out flyers to the schools that they could disseminate to their students and their parents, and we also sent out Connect Ed messages to inform the parents and guardians when those upcoming meetings would be held. Again, those meetings were all held in both English and in Spanish. Next slide, please. So we always have guiding parameters that sort of set the stage to our option development. It is, of course, the first one is to advance the policy factors. We have 4 factors. We always try to maximize walkers. We look to grandfather grade 5 students and grade 8 students if we're doing middle schools, and in this case, we were looking at middle schools. Due to the geography and the driving distances, not all elementary schools would be relieved of the space deficits through the boundary study. And what we always try to do is minimize island assignments, which are those non-contiguous assignments in service areas. Next slide. So our option development, again, we did a total of 7 staff-developed options. In all of the options, we tried to advance the 4 factors. Again, characteristics of student population, geography, stability of school assignment over time, and facility utilization. We always look to those factors in developing our options. Next slide. So for option development for the 3 schools noted, and it's Gaithersburg, Strawberry Knoll, and Summit Hall, we wanted to make note that in these service areas, the student enrollment in the walk zones is similar to the student capacity, meaning that the size of the walk zone actually equals or almost equals the actual capacity of the school. So in some of the options, it was difficult to actually reduce the capacity below what the capacity of the school is without then moving walkers. And that was, again, looking at our guiding parameters, as well as even one of the factors, geography. Having, maintaining walkers and maximizing walkers is something that we always do, so we always try to strive to do. So in some of the options, you will see that some of the utilizations do not fall below what the capacity of the school is. Next slide, please. So again, looking at option development, elementary schools are divided into smaller zones to create those options. We always try to do that. You're not moving a whole service area. You're moving pieces of the service areas. And we look to do that in what makes sense so that there is not a large zone. And if you just move that one zone, then you can't really have other options. All schools were not considered in each of the options. And in fact, there are 2 schools, Goshen and Laytonsville Elementary School, that were not reassigned in any of the options. We talk about here on the slide why that is. Those 2 schools do have the lowest farms percentages of the elementary schools in the cluster. However, they also are the furthest from the elementary schools with the highest farms percentages. So if you look at this map, you can see where Laytonsville and Goshen is. And then you can see, again, that teal color is Gaithersburg Elementary School. The yellow color is Summit Hall Elementary School. We talk about one of the things that we did look at. This is a high farm school. All these schools are class size reduction schools. There is no public transportation to Laytonsville Elementary School, and there is no direct public transportation to Goshen Elementary Schools. Both schools are not overutilized. Again, Goshen and Laytonsville are not overutilized. So as part of the boundary study, when you're looking at utilization, they were not overutilized. So what would occur if we were trying to, and we talked about this when we presented the report back in March, that if we were to move students out of Laytonville and out of Goshen in order to look at the farms percentages and to reduce the disparity of those farms percentages, what you would be doing is moving those students out, and you would move students then back in. You'd have to backfill them with students from either Gaithersburg, Washington Grove, any of the other schools, because they aren't overutilized, and you'd be bringing those students to schools that are already overutilized. So for example, Strawberry Knoll, for example, they were, I believe, 200 and something students over. If you'd be bringing students in, the school would even be more overutilized. Then you'd have to take even more students out in order to address that overutilization, but also to put students back into Goshen or Laytonsville to bring them closer back to their capacities. Next slide, please. So review of issues. In the Gaithersburg service area, walk areas do overlap. This is just specifically for Gaithersburg Elementary School. The service area, there are students that can walk to both Gaithersburg Elementary School and to the new elementary school. The number of students in Strawberry Knoll and Summit Hall, walk zones are similar or greater than their school capacity. That's what I alluded to before, that even taking all the students out, you still could be potentially overutilized or right there because their walk zones are so large. Again, the walk zones, it made it challenging in many of the staff developed options to address that space deficit, because then we would be considering moving out or reassigning students that actually can walk to that school. We do have an approved capacity study for Watkins Mill Elementary School, looking at the overutilization in Watkins Mill, as well as being able to, and the scope of that capacity study did include adjacent clusters. So we will be exploring, based upon the recommendation by the superintendent for this boundary study, we will be exploring the schools that potentially did remain overutilized and the connections between Watkins Mill and that service area, the northern part of Gaithersburg Gaithersburg cluster, which does include, of course, Goshen and Laytonsville, but can also include Strawberry Knoll as well. And then the adjacent cluster to that, which is Magruder cluster. There are several schools in the Magruder cluster that are overutilized. So we want to take a look at those elementary schools as well. So that capacity study, again, is looking at the Watkins Mill, all the Watkins Mill elementary schools, including South Lake. Because if you recall, South Lake is approaching 900 kids. They're at 8 and change now. But will, with their new major capital project, we are only building them to just under 800. So it is something that we also have to address when they come and return back to their school, once that school goes through their major capital project. So again, that Watkins Mill study will look at the Watkins Mill schools, some of the schools in the Gaithersburg cluster, and the Magruder cluster as well. Next slide, please. So the district-wide boundary analysis, the board did have, and the school system conducted that district-wide boundary analysis. There was data that was included in that analysis that is similar to the data that we use when we do our boundary studies. Again, those 4 factors. Geography is one of them. In the boundary study, as previously noted, there are large areas that are large, dense areas, and a lot of the students do walk to those schools. The analysis report noted that there is overwhelming support for students to attend schools close to their homes. And when considering diversity of a school as it relates to the policy factor, the analysis noted various viewpoints. The survey data for this boundary study in particular noted that for those who responded, yielded similar results to that analysis. However, when we did some individual feedback, certainly in those focus groups, and when we did our individuals, when we went back to the schools and did some individual targeting of those elementary schools, it did result in stronger support for the demographic characteristics of student population, but did note, of course, geography is a factor that they are concerned with, but they also were concerned with and supported that demographic characteristic factor. While the scope of the boundary study only included the cluster and elementary schools and middle schools, after the superintendent's recommendation, it does incorporate much of that same data, because again, the data in the district-wide boundary analysis is data that we use as part of our process as well, our boundary study process as well. Next slide. So to formulate the recommendation, the interim superintendent reviewed and considered all the 7 options, as well as the stakeholder input that we received through the context of those policy factors. The superintendent did review the district-wide boundary analysis, again, that provided that district-wide or comprehensive look of those 4 factors. During the review process, Dr. McKnight did ask staff to develop some variations on our developed options, which is something that we do as part of our process. And after a review of all of that information, Dr. McKnight did recommend a variation of option 4, which she believed most advanced our 4 factors, in looking at those 4 factors. So next slide. So now I will go through what that variation of option 4 actually is. The recommendation includes the following reassignments to Gaithersburg number 8, which is the new elementary school. We have zones GA1B, GA2, GA3, GA4, and 5 from Gaithersburg Elementary School. So those zones from Gaithersburg Elementary School are being recommended to be reassigned to the new school. Reassigning zones R3, R5, 6, and 7 from Rosemont. So those zones at Rosemont being reassigned to the new elementary school. And then from Washington Grove Elementary School, W2 is being recommended to be reassigned to Gaithersburg number 8. To Gaithersburg Elementary School, the recommendation includes reassigning SK2 and 3, which is Strawberry Knoll. So 2 zones in Strawberry Knoll being reassigned to Gaithersburg Gaithersburg Elementary School. To Rosemont Elementary School are zones SU 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those are 4 zones from Summit Hall Elementary School that are being recommended to be reassigned to Rosemont Elementary School. And finally, to Washington Grove are 2, 4, and 9, which are 3 zones in the current Rosemont service area that are being recommended to be reassigned to Washington Grove Elementary School. At the middle school level, the recommendation assigns the entire Gaithersburg number 8 service area to Forest Oak Middle School, so there is no split articulation of Gaithersburg number 8. They are being all recommended to be reassigned to Forest Oak. And in order to do that, the recommendation does reassign Washington Grove Elementary School from Forest Oak to Gaithersburg Middle School. So let's look at that in a picture, because I think it's a little easier to see it this way. And then we can talk about the demographic changes, the utilization, and the geography as well. So if we just look at the map, and we start talking about, and what we did was we sort of took the top off to look at really the schools that are affected. And we start with, let's start at the top with Strawberry Knoll. So you can see what is being reassigned from Strawberry Knoll. So if you look at the pink, there are now 2 pink zones remaining. The top little sliver is Strawberry Knoll. The larger part of that pink is all the walk zone for Strawberry Knoll. And that is remaining, and the next 2 zones right underneath it are the 2 that are being reassigned to Gaithersburg Elementary School. Again, Gaithersburg Elementary School is in that teal color. So the new, and then I'll also just go into the new Gaithersburg Elementary School. So you can see what remains at Gaithersburg Elementary School is the large walk zone, which is where it says Gaithersburg, the zone to the left, and those 2 zones that come from, which is an existing Gaithersburg Elementary School zone and remains a Gaithersburg Elementary zone. And then those 2 zones that are the north of it that were Strawberry Knoll zones that are now being reassigned to Gaithersburg Elementary School. So you can see that the new service area for Gaithersburg Elementary School is now that new teal color. I will go to now the new elementary school. So the new elementary school is made up of zones from Rosemont and from 1 from Washington Grove, and the remaining from Gaithersburg Elementary School. So you can see that orange color is what makes up the new Gaithersburg number 8 service area. And the hatch marks that you can see are all of the walk zones that are now part of that Gaithersburg Elementary School, the new Gaithersburg Elementary School. And that walk zone is actually from Gaithersburg, the existing Gaithersburg Elementary, but it is also actually a portion of Strawberry Knoll that can actually now walk to the new Gaithersburg Elementary School. And actually also the W2, there's a portion of the W2, which is the Washington Grove, that can also now walk to the new elementary school and could not walk to Washington Grove Elementary School. So we talk about maximizing walkers. Certainly this recommendation does maximize walkers the best way that we could. In looking at, we'll go to Rosemont, which is that red color. You could see to the left of the new elementary school, there is all of the Summit Hall zones that could not walk to Summit Hall Elementary School are all now being reassigned to Rosemont, which means that Summit Hall Elementary School, which is that yellow, is now 100% walking school, with the exception, of course, of special ed, if there's any special ed that would get bused. But all of the students, there is now one zone that makes up Summit Hall, and that one zone are all walkers. That is the complete walk zone. The rest of those zones were reassigned to Rosemont Elementary School. If we look at Rosemont, Rosemont is one, when we talk about geography, which is the last column in that table, all of the zones are contiguous except for Rosemont. Rosemont was actually not contiguous before. There is a zone up in that area right to the north of Summit Hall, to the left of the new Gaithersburg, that did actually go to Summit Hall, to Rosemont, and it continues to go to Rosemont along with all of those zones from Summit Hall. So that makes up one portion of the Rosemont service area. The second part of Rosemont is that hatch-marked area where actually Rosemont is, and a portion of that can walk. And the last part is that island assignment that you can see to the left of Washington Grove. It's actually to the left of 270, to the west side of 270, and that is Crown. Crown does, part of Rosemont's service area is the Crown community, and that is Crown, and that remained in Rosemont. The last service area is Washington Grove. To the south of Washington, to the south of Rosemont, the walking zone of Rosemont, that used to be Rosemont as well, and now it is being recommended to be reassigned to Washington Grove. So that zone now is part of the Washington Grove service area, and that's the only change or students to be reassigned to Washington Grove. There was the W2, which is in that orange zone that moves to the new elementary school. So you can see from the picture, the service area is contiguous. The service area is pretty compact for those schools that were impacted by the recommendation, with the exception of Rosemont. Again, Rosemont was a non-contiguous service area, and with this recommendation continues to be a non-contiguous service area. If we look at the farms percentages, the current versus the change, which looking at this chart, you can see Gaithersburg currently is 85.1% farms. It is reduced to 77.7. The new elementary school is 76.4. Rosemont is reduced from 60 to 51. Strawberry Knoll is increased from 48 to 54. Summit Hall is an example of where we did reduce their farms percentage. Remember that the only students that are left at Summit Hall are walkers. So if there wanted to be a further impact to the farms percentage, reducing that farms percentage, it would be looking at moving students who currently can walk to Summit Hall. And lastly, Washington Grove goes from 66% to 52% farms. And I want to note, and we've talked about this almost every time we do a boundary study, that sometimes the percentage of farms changes, gets reduced or even increased. And it is not because necessarily the reassignment of students. It is because you have a group of students currently, and that number is reduced because you're reassigning students out. And so if there is a percentage of farm students, but that denominator, and we talk about sort of the numerator and the denominator gets smaller, the percentage of farm students actually gets higher simply because you now have less students in the school. So I want to make that, we talk about with the community all the time, because they look at it and they say, well, we have less students, or we have even more students, but they weren't farm students. The percentage of farm students actually does change simply because of the number of students that are now currently at the school, whether they increase or decrease. If we look at the utilization, you can see that the utilizations are pretty comparable, with the exception of Strawberry Knoll. And we just talked about that with the Watkins Mill capacity study, that for any schools that did stay overutilized, or even their adjacency between the Watkins Mill community, the Magruder community, You can see, if you look on the map again, Watkins Mill is to the left, to the west of Strawberry Knoll, Goshen, even Gaithersburg. Magruder is to the right, to the east of some of those schools in, whether it's Strawberry Knoll, again, Goshen, the new elementary school. And so having that connection between those two clusters, that northern part of Gaithersburg, is what we will be looking at for that Watkins Mill capacity study. And again, geography we talk about, these are all contiguous service areas, again, with the exception of Rosemont, which was not contiguous before and continues to be not contiguous in this recommendation. Next slide. And we can come back to this with questions. We could circle back to the slide. With respect to the middle schools, again, the recommendation is to have Gaithersburg number 8, the new elementary school, straight articulate to Forest Oak Middle School. And in order to do that, we reassigned the service area for Washington Grove to now be reassigned to Gaithersburg Middle School instead of what they are currently assigned at, which is Forest Oak. And again, you can see the farms percentage. This actually reduces the disparity in the farms percentage, this recommendation. Utilization, you could see Forest Oak is at 84%, so that range between 80 and 100. Gaithersburg Middle School is just a little bit over in their utilization. And both of these are non-contiguous. They were non-contiguous before because of the way the service area is, and they just continue to be non-contiguous. I do want to bring up one point with Washington Grove, the W2. So in the elementary recommendation, we moved that W2 to the new elementary school. As I said, they were not walkers, the W2 zone, and now they are walkers at the elementary school. At the middle school, however, that W2 zone was a walker to Forest Oak. That service area was walkers to Forest Oak. Now they will be bus riders to Gaithersburg. So it's a switch, actually. Again, they weren't able to walk to Washington Grove. Now they can walk to Gaithersburg number 8. They were able to walk to Forest Oak. Now they will be bus riders to Gaithersburg. So it's a switch almost in their bus riding. But they will be able to be walkers to the new elementary school. Next slide. So I know you can't see this, but we wanted to just put this in. It's in your packet, of course. I can't see it, and I can't even see it when it's on my paper, even with my glasses. But it is in the board's presentation, and the reason why we wanted to put it in there for community members who are going to be looking at this, the presentation. It is also, of course, in the superintendent's recommendation. It is just the school by school. It is almost a more detailed version of the little table that we just showed you. That's all it is. It just shows the school by school information. It shows what was the no change and what is the change based upon the superintendent's recommendation. So it is there. If there are any questions, the community will have it as well. Next slide. So implementation, this is a little confusing. It is much more involved than a typical implementation. So I want to go through it, and we can go and we can talk through it. And if there are any questions, we can again circle back to it. So the superintendent's recommendation is to implement this at grades pre-K to 4, meaning grade 5 is grandfathered at their home school. But specifically for this recommendation, it's specific zones and schools that we are recommending sort of this first wave of implementation. So let me explain. So in pre-K through 4, beginning in the 2020 school year, August of 2022, students in grade 5 remain at their current school. That's for every school that was impacted by the boundary study, followed by a full implementation of grades pre-K through 5 the following year. That's sort of the typical. It is for these following zones. For GA 1B, 2, 3, 4, and 5 from Gaithersburg to Gaithersburg number 8, the new school. For zones R3, 5, 6, and 7 from Rosemont, again to the new school. For zones SK2 and 3 from Strawberry Knoll to Gaithersburg Elementary School. And for zones SU2, 3, 4, 5 from Summit Hall to Rosemont. So for all of these zones at all of these schools, the implementation is pre-K to 4 and then grandfathering the following year, grandfathering fifth graders that current year, August of 2022, for full implementation the following year. Very typical of what we do. The next slide, please. This is where the change is, or the little bit more complicated gets. Washington Grove Elementary School has the two-way language immersion program. Therefore, the implementation recommendation is a little bit different for these zones that were impacted, meaning students that are leaving Washington Grove or students that are coming in and being reassigned to Washington Grove. And that is because of the two-way language immersion. So for zone W2, the zone that we moved from Washington Grove to the new elementary school, those students being reassigned from Washington Grove to Gaithersburg number 8, the recommendation is it would begin with grades pre-K and kindergarten, meaning if you're a pre-K or kindergarten student in August of 2022 and you're in the W2 zone, you get reassigned to Gaithersburg number 8. However, students in grades 1 through 5 can remain at Washington Grove to complete the two-way immersion program. And the idea behind this, and this is similar if the board members that were here when we did College Gardens, when we opened up Bayard Rustin, and College Gardens had the early IB program, the early years program, that the recommendation, and we talked about this with the superintendent, that the students are already invested. They've had 2 years in pre-K and kindergarten. So the idea of moving them out, they've already been invested, already been part of the program. So the recommendation is to allow those students to finish out that two-way immersion program at Washington Grove. So that's the first part, students moving out of Washington Grove. So full implementation, if you keep that recommendation that the superintendent is putting forward, the full implementation just for that one zone would be in the 26-27 school year, meaning those students who will be in grades 1 through 5, starting in August of 22, allow them to stay, finish out that two-way immersion. So for all those students to articulate out of elementary school would be in the 26-27 school year. And remember, it's just for that one zone, just for W2. For zones R2, 4, and 9, students being reassigned from Rosemont into Washington Grove. The recommendation is to have those students be reassigned pre-K and kindergarten only. So again, if I am a pre-kindergartner or kindergartner in those 3 zones in Rosemont, going from Rosemont to Washington Grove, it is pre-kindergarten and kindergarten, with the idea that they can go into the two-way immersion program and be successful if they're entering in pre-kindergarten or kindergarten. Full implementation, again, wouldn't happen until the 27-28 school year, having those students fully come in pre-kindergarten and kindergarten and articulating through K1 and 5. For grades 1 through 5 at Rosemont, so students again in those 3 zones are 2, 4, and 9 in the 2022-3 school year, which is August of 2022. If any of those students can meet the language requirement, because there is a language requirement for that two-way immersion program, they can then go and be reassigned to participate and be reassigned to Washington Grove. If they don't meet that requirement, then they can remain at Rosemont Elementary School until 5th grade. So for example, I am a 2nd grader in R2. I get reassigned to Washington Grove. I take that requirement test, that whatever the criteria is, and I am successful, and I meet those criteria, I can go to Washington Grove. If I don't meet that criteria, I can stay at Rosemont and finish out my years because I don't meet that criteria. And that exists currently. If you are a student that moves into the Washington Grove area, a second grader, a third grader, you also do have to meet the criteria. If you do not, there are actually 2 schools that students can go to. Rosemont is actually one of them. So in this case, that actually makes sense that those students then can remain. And we did that in the past when we had sending and receiving schools for Title I. There were those schools that were other schools. These have been, and Rosemont has been identified as one of those other schools if you don't meet that criteria. I think maybe, should we pause here just if there are any questions about the implementation? Okay.
Ms. O'Looney, I think you indicated you had a question.
Yes, I have a question going way back to option development. I would just like some clarification on why the Goshen and Laytonsville elementary schools weren't included in any of the options. Is it because of the lack of transportation in getting students into those schools? Is that the reason?
No, so it was multifolded. And we did talk to Dr. McKnight. We had lengthy conversations about this. So it was one, it wasn't about the students being bused, because of course if a student is reassigned to a school, the student can go. It is about parent participation. It is about having parents be able to, if their child is sick, be able to go and get their student from the school. These are impacted communities. These are Title I, class size reduction schools, high farm schools. It may be that some parents rely on public transportation, and so it would be considered a hardship for those parents to be able to get to their students. Again, there is no public transportation that goes up to Laytonsville, and there is no direct public transportation that is at Goshen, to get to Goshen Elementary School, again, from that lower part of the service area. There was also other reasons. Again, when looking at the geography, both Goshen and Laytonsville are not overutilized. So again, if we were to reassign students out of Laytonsville or Goshen and then reassign them further south, we then would have to take students from further south and backfill those students, because then there would be more space even at Laytonsville or Goshen and impacting students more for the reassignment in the what I would consider the lower schools, or the schools that are much closer in that service area, as opposed to sort of the handle. You sort of have the circle and then you sort of have the handle. So it was a combination of both. It wasn't just one or the other. It was about having access to school, having parents to be able to have access to school, and what that would mean if they couldn't have that access because the public transportation, if they rely on it, as well as the impact of the purpose of opening a new school is to relieve that overutilization, and those 2 schools were not overutilized, are not overutilized.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? Ms. Silvestri?
No, Lynn has one.
Well,
I'm still getting my thoughts
Okay.
together.
Ms. Harris?
Just a question about the interface between Rosemont and Washington Grove. So because of the language requirement for the two-way immersion program at Washington Grove, and you mentioned, Ms. Kermies, that currently students assigned living in the Washington Grove service area have to take that assessment, and then if they don't meet the language requirement, they go to, I think you said either.
It's Rosemont, and there is another school in the Magruder cluster, and
Okay.
it just escapes me which one it is, but there is another school in the Magruder cluster that parents, I guess, can opt for. I don't know, to be honest, if it is, this is where your child will go, or this is a choice that you have.
Okay. And so are we, over time, the interplay of how that language requirement plays in with students and their service areas, are we pretty confident with the changes here that the balance will continue and that we won't be over or underutilizing?
Once, we believe, once this sort of implementation finishes, then it will be just like it is today, that if you move into the service area and a student doesn't meet the requirement, then it's one of those two schools, no different than it is today. It's just getting through this group of students who may, and there could be students who meet the criteria, who are currently attending Rosemont, and if they do, then they would be reassigned to Washington Grove, and if not, they would remain. But it is just this cohort, and then it would sort of be the way it is today.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Silvestri.
Thank you. Two questions is, I think I'm understanding the language programming, but it does take a careful balance, right, in terms of population, and Washington Grove loses some ESOL capacity, which I'm using as a proxy for Spanish speakers, and also community engagement to get buy-in from the parents that this is what they want, this is the school that they want. So I guess let's just be very careful to make sure that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater in the programming designed for Washington Grove. My second question, and I think I've asked this before, but I'm not remembering the answer, is this is such a construed little area. And what about adjacent clusters, right? Wasn't that a big take-home message from the boundary analysis? And what does the future hold for areas that are so restricted? Because the population is very homogeneous here. That doesn't give us a lot of room to do anything substantive. So what does the analysis tell us that we should be doing, that we might do in the future to give us more flexibility in balancing out the factors?
So when we talked about this boundary study, and we had one or two before, and we'll have one that we're going to be talking about next, we did sort of talk about that there will be, and I remember this conversation last year with Dr. Zuckerman, there will be some boundary recommendations that are very subscriptive, that are for a specific purpose, that may address certain schools and may not go further than that. And then there will be opportunities for us to look further. And so while this one was a little bit more specific, because it was looking to relieve the overutilization at a number of the elementary schools in the cluster, what I talked about for the Watkins Mill capacity study that eventually potentially could lead to both non-capital, meaning boundary, and capital solutions, that we're taking a half a step back, or maybe even a full step back, and looking at it more across the board. So that will actually include the Watkins Mill cluster, the Gaithersburg cluster, and the Magruder cluster. 3 adjacent clusters looking at their elementary schools, looking at their utilizations, looking at their demographics, and looking at geography. So we will have a sort of a second opportunity to look at this cluster in the context of 2 other clusters, 3 clusters across the board.
And timeline for that?
So we are looking at the study now. We said that we will be looking at it in the 22 school year, so meaning the 22-23 school year. So there are no recommendations, either non-capital or capital, for this CIP, but certainly there is opportunities for next fall for us to figure out, based upon where South Lake falls in their capacity. Once this boundary study is done and we go through a year of enrollment to see where these schools land, and then what the overutilization is in the Magruder cluster. Also giving a little bit more opportunity for COVID to, and our enrollment projections to maybe bounce back yet again, and then see where that utilization, where it is and needs to be addressed.
Would these schools be not touched in that process because they were just moved in this process?
So we always say we look at one of the 4 factors is stability of school assignment over time. And when we say this, we always talk about specific students, not families or not schools. So clearly, if the recommendation, regardless of, superintendent's recommendation, of course, is in front of you, but the recommendation, we would, if there was any kind of non-capital solution that would be recommended next year, we certainly would look at those kids who were currently impacted by the recommendation. But that doesn't mean that if they have a family member that has a third grader and has a kindergartner coming in next year, the kindergartner can be affected because it is about specific students, not about families or service areas.
Yeah, just because of the complexity of this with Washington Grove, phase grandfathering, and because of the language needs. And I did notice that the numbers here overall did not decline during COVID. They slowed, but the increase was small, but continued to increase, which I think is interesting. Thank you.
Ms. Mandrowski.
Yeah, thanks. Couple just quick questions. When you held the meetings, the further meetings, did you get a good turnout? There wasn't any numbers.
We did, if I recall, we had probably about 20, 25 people from each school come in and participate. There were Spanish speakers, which we were really glad to see. And again, we were able to have them ask us questions and be able to answer them in Spanish. We, again, as I said, we didn't go through all of the options because if it was a first-time person coming in, we really wanted to hear from them, which is, I think, what you wanted us to sort of get from them, what was important to them. Was it geography? Was it demographics? Was it a combination of both? Were they, and so that's what we were able to get from the questions that we asked, which were different than the typical survey questions that we used during the option development.
Okay, cool. And so these questions are kind of raw. I don't know if this is something, if we've considered making the new elementary school a two-way immersion program or not, but it might be something we want to think about in terms of keeping that area, the flow for, as they all go to middle schools together and all of that kind of stuff, just for programmatic purposes, which has nothing to do with this, but I just want to throw it out there. But I did want to ask if the new school will have wraparound services like linkages to learning or a wellness center or any of those type of things.
It has linkages to learning. Doesn't have a wellness center. But it has linkages to learning. It is part of the school that will be built.
Okay, but, and then my question in reference to that is, I don't know what the cutoff points are for additional services like the focus schools versus Title I and things. Did our change in numbers affect anybody losing service, encourage someone to lose services?
So that was actually just recently brought up, and I can't remember where that was brought up because we talked about Summit Hall. And while their numbers did go down, they didn't go down. They went down, but I don't think that they went down enough. There could be, and it's something that we can look at, and we did talk about what that means and what that impact could be to staffing. It is a balance, what we try to do, and I'm not talking about the demographics, I'm just talking about looking at the factors. And so while you're trying to reduce overutilization, there could be an impact at that point. Again, I think that Mrs. Evans said that when looking at these, there isn't, the disparity was reduced, but if you look at the schools, they didn't change much because again, they do have such large walk zones and all of the kids in the service area are actually represented in each of those zones.
Right.
And so I don't have a definite answer, but it's certainly something that we can look at and.
Absolutely. I just wanted to comment. Thank you for that point, Ms. Mandrowski. I mean, we were thinking about that when we talked about how do we want to keep these communities close together, because we know that a lot of times we intentionally place those places where we need the support. However, moving forward, I think that's been one big item that we've been reflecting on in terms of who needs support and where we put it. Quite frankly, we need support much more than we did prior to the pandemic. across all of our schools. So right now, it's really kind of stepping back and looking at that model of how are we making sure that the support is provided not just in these individual pockets of schools, but to families that need them in a more centralized way. But definitely a priority moving forward.
I appreciate that. I just know when I'm out in the community and I go talking to these families specifically, it was something that was very, very important to them, is that they didn't want, they wanted to be able to walk, and they wanted to not lose any of their services, especially like the wellness centers and stuff. So I just appreciate that you're keeping that in mind. They didn't want bigger classes. They like the benefits of that, some of those services really provide. So thank you.
Ms. Harris?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Ms. Smondrowski's questions reminded me of something I was wondering about, going back to the two-way immersion at Washington Grove. And I noticed from this recommendation, the Washington Grove students would be reassigned from Forest Oak to Gaithersburg Middle. And does that, I would assume that we have sort of a special educational programming available at the middle school level for these students who came through, 6 years of two-way immersion. And so is Gaithersburg Middle, are we just going to move that programming from Washington Grove to Gaithersburg Middle to accommodate the two-way immersion students coming in from Washington Grove, or does the capacity already exist at Gaithersburg Middle?
We would make the adjustments necessary at Gaithersburg Middle to be able to accommodate the students coming in from Washington Grove. This is, again, technically we're looking at where we're moving students to address these priorities that we've been looking at, but the programs provide implications for that. So, yes.
Okay.
All right, I think that's everyone. You want to continue?
Yes, next slide. So we talked about the elementary school implementation. There is also an impact to the middle school articulation as well. So for the middle schools, the reassignment will be implemented beginning with grades 6 and 7, again, grandfathering the 8th graders in August of 22, followed by full implementation 6 and 8 in 23-24 school year. Same students that we're talking about. So for the students in zones R2, 4, and 9 that are reassigned to Washington Grove, but do not meet the language requirement for the two-way immersion and therefore remain at Rosemont Elementary School, the recommendation, and again, it's only for these students, only this period of time, that these students get a choice of either going to Forest Oak or Gaithersburg Middle School when they articulate to grade 6. And the idea behind this is that they will be, these are students that are being reassigned that were not before in the Washington Grove service area. So they now have made and have their friends, have their cohort at Rosemont Elementary School, which is then articulating to Forest Oak Middle School and not Gaithersburg. But they also are now in the service area of Washington Grove and not Rosemont. So giving, again, it's just these students a choice. They can either stay with their school cohort and go to Forest Oak, or they can stay with their home and neighborhood cohort and go to Gaithersburg Middle School. They all, remember, go to Gaithersburg High School. So in the end, they're all going to high school together. It's just for the 3 years at middle school. And again, it is just these cohorts of kids. So once we get through the 26-27 school year, it isn't an issue. It's just for these students being immediately reassigned that do not meet that criteria to then be reassigned to Washington Grove.
And Ms. Carmihouse, thank you for that point. I wanted to point, when we looked at the number of students here, it was not a large number, I think.
It is not a large number. It's by grade, we're talking about less than 10, I think it was less than 10 kids. And again, and that's by grade. So if you grade all them up, you're talking about 70 kids within the zone, but by grade, it's about 10 kids. And again, it is absolutely possible that some of these kids who are in first grade or second grade can meet that criteria, in which case then they would automatically be reassigned to Washington Grove. So it wouldn't be those students. It would only be those students who do not meet that criteria. And remembering too that it's a pretty compact service area. So picking up from Rosemont to go to Forest Oak or go to Gaithersburg is not a long distance. It is an impact on transportation, absolutely. They will have to figure out their routes, but it is a small cohort per grade of students that would be affected by it. Okay, next slide. So the summary of the recommendation, it does maintain the current walk areas for elementary schools in the cluster. It provides compact and contiguous boundaries for the schools with the exception of Rosemont that does have a current non-contiguous zone that will remain non-contiguous. It allows students from Washington Grove, again, we talked about that W2 zone, who previously cannot walk to Washington Grove, can now actually walk to their elementary school, but it does flip their walkability, that now they will be bused to Gaithersburg, whereas they currently walk to Forest Oak. It allows students from Rosemont zones 4, 5, and 6 to walk to Washington Grove, which they would not be able to do before. And of course, maximizing the number of walkers does have an impact on having less buses or not needing as many buses, which of course reduces the impact on the operating budget and the environment. Next slide. And we are back to discussion. So if there are any other questions on any of the slides from the recommendation.
Ms. Sylvester.
Can you remind me when the changes will begin?
Sure, so the school opens August of 22, this coming next school year, August of 2022. So the board acts on the 18th of November, I believe, and then the implementation will begin that following school year.
Is there any feedback from families in terms of they just came back to school, they're just getting bonded with their school, and now they're going to move in August?
So we haven't heard. I am sure you will be hearing. You know, and we do get calls, you know, not happy with the recommendation or support the recommendation. We always say that sort of our office, we have done our first part, and if they want to share either good things or not so good things, that we always say, please contact the board. It is now at the board. The superintendent has made the recommendation. We always say that there's opportunities for public hearing, public comment, writing board members, and so I'm sure you will be hearing in the next few weeks.
I think the communication plan is going to be really important because it is complicated, right? This little neighborhood gets to do this, and this little neighborhood gets to do that, so special attention to that will be important. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other lights right now. Do you want to continue?
Sure.
Did you have something, Ms. Mendoza?
Yeah, just two things really quickly in terms of reaching out. I do want to take yet another opportunity to introduce our new ombudsman, Ravel Fitzpatrick. Thank you for joining us and welcome. If parents have concerns and stuff like that, I just wanted to do another little introduction so people are aware. He can help reach out to him. Because we're talking about Gaithersburg, I voted this weekend, and I just want to remind everybody who did not early vote to vote on November 2nd. Thank you.
You want to start it?
Thank you. You could continue.
Whatever you want to do.
Adrian, you can continue, or Seth, whoever's continue.
Okay, so next we are going to do our second boundary recommendation, which is supplement B. It's the interim superintendent's recommendation for Bethesda, Somerset, and Westbrook elementary schools. Next slide, please. So in November of 2020, the Board of Education authorized a boundary study to explore the reassignment of students from Bethesda and Somerset to Westbrook Elementary School. No middle school or high school boundaries are included because all of the three schools articulate to the same middle school and the same high school. If you could see the picture here. The green is Bethesda's service area. The gold is Somerset's service area, and the blue is Westbrook's service area. Next slide, please. So you can see here on this slide, we have both the enrollment and the demographic data for these 3 schools. Again, we were a year ahead, so we used official 2020-21 school year data and the 6 years that were included in the CIP for that. So you can see for Bethesda, in the last year of the CIP, they are over 181 students. Somerset, over 31 students, overutilized by 31. And Westbrook has available 265 seats, and this does include, if you can see, the program capacity for Westbrook does change. It goes from 547 to 614. That is based upon the approved shell build-out of those 3 classrooms at Westbrook Elementary School. So it does provide them, I think, another like almost 70 seats. So that does provide them a total of 265 seats available. Looking at the demographic data, again, we can look at the farms percentage. You can see Bethesda is current, this is last year's data, is 12.1% farms, Somerset is 12.2%, and Westbrook has no farms students at the school currently. Next slide, please. So community meetings, we did them actually similar. We hold all of our meetings similar. This one did start though virtual. There were no meetings that were in person. The Q&A function was used for attendees to submit questions. We found that really helpful. If you remember, we did for the Northwest, Clarksburg, and Seneca Valley, we started questions on index cards when we were in person. So we thought that we would transition, since we were transitioning virtually, we did that in the Q&A function, and it worked really well. We left time at the end of every meeting to answer all the questions that were posed in that Q&A function. The first set of meetings were public information meetings, and it provided an overview of the process, the timeline for the process, and of course, opportunities for Q&A at the end. The second set of meetings included a presentation of the first round of options. There were 5 options that were developed during that first round. The presentation included the guiding parameters for the option development, as well as a review of the policy factors and background, again, similar to all of our boundary studies. One meeting was recorded and posted on our planning website to allow stakeholders who couldn't attend the meeting to view that meeting. And then we had another meeting that would, of course, have the Q&A session available. Based on the input that we received after the second set of meetings and feedback from the first survey that we presented, staff determined that additional options were needed, and so we had a third set of meetings that included a second round of options, which were 4 that were developed. So we had a total of 9 staff-developed options for this boundary study. Next slide, please. Again, our guiding parameters, advancing the Board of Education policy factors, those 4 factors, the same factors, maximizing walkers, grandfathering grade 5 students. Due to the geography and driving, not all elementary schools were relieved, similar to the way that we have it for, again, most boundary studies. Trying to minimize island assignments. And for the second round of options, an additional guiding parameter was added from what we heard from the community and their feedback, try to maximize facility utilization at more schools. So they were asking us to come up with additional options that looked at the utilization factor. Next slide, please. Again, I won't go through these, but of course we use our 4 factors. We advance those 4 factors in each of the options that we develop. Again, characteristics of student population, geography, stability of school assignment, and facility utilization. Next slide, please. So the interim superintendent's recommendation, the review of issues, the service area, and as you saw the map, Bethesda, Somerset, and Westbrook, they are adjacent. This was very important, and actually we've had some, when Ms. Smandrowski asked us Ms. Silvestri asked us whether we have heard from some people. We actually have heard some feedback from the community. We've had a few calls to our office asking about Somerset. And one of the things that we did in doing this boundary study and looking at options, Somerset Elementary School sits on a 3.7 acre site. It is the second smallest site that we have for elementary schools in the county. So one of the issues when we reviewed the options and even developing the options, concerns regarding relocatables, placing relocatables would be a challenge, almost impossible. So providing ample capacity, a little more flexibility at Somerset is what we were looking at, was certainly a consideration during this boundary study process, because if the school gets overutilized, once we're done with the boundary reassignment, what to do with those students and that extra staff was definitely a concern for us. So that was something that we did consider and was reviewed during our conversations with the superintendent. By the 2026-27 school year, Bethesda is projected to be 741 students, 181 seats more than its capacity. Somerset is projected to be 546 students, 31 seats more than its capacity. And again, Westbrook will have capacity, 198 seats available with a capacity, the current capacity of 547. Remember, I think it goes to 614 or 17 with the shell build out. Next slide. Again, on May 2020, the council adopted, and this is just giving a little bit of history, sort of how we got to where we are. The county council adopted the 21 to 26 CIP for MCPS, which did include an addition for Bethesda. So this is sort of taking a step back, just letting you know how we got to where we are. That addition was included in the county council's adopted CIP. The board also had an addition, that 3 classroom shell build out for Westbrook in that 21 to 26 CIP. However, it was not included in the council's adopted CIP. We had to provide them, again, if you recall, we do non-recommended reductions. One of them was Westbrook. They took that project out due to fiscal constraints. And so we had the addition for Bethesda, but not the addition for Westbrook. Next slide. Again, looking at the district-wide boundary analysis.
I think you missed the part where
Oh.
Bethesda came out, though.
Oh, can you go back one slide? Did I jump ahead? The county council approved, so when we did the amended, I went through the slides very quickly, my apologies. When we went through the amended CIP, the 21 to 26 CIP, which was released in December of 2020, the Board of Education did eliminate the addition for Bethesda Elementary School and actually restored the funds to Westbrook. And we were able to do that. The addition for Bethesda Elementary School, I believe, was over $16 million. The shell build out for Westbrook is $4.4 million. So in looking at fiscal concerns that we had during the amended CIP, which was last year, that was a change that the superintendent made in order to divert some of those funds from the Bethesda Elementary School addition to the Westbrook, but also utilize the available capacity that was at Westbrook. And then with the 3 classroom addition, there's actually even more capacity available in order to do this boundary study. Thank you. So based on the student enrollment now, and based upon that shell build out, there are 265 seats available at Westbrook to look at reassignments from Bethesda and Somerset. Next slide, please. So the district-wide boundary analysis, again, similar to what I talked about in Gaithersburg, it did look at our 4 factors, similar to what we do when we're doing our boundary studies. The survey data from this boundary study, based on those that responded, yielded similar results to the analysis, which is looking at having schools close to home. Again, more than 70% of the respondents indicated that geography was the most important factor, actually in both surveys, because we have a first survey based upon the first set of options that are developed, and then we have a second survey based upon all the options that were developed. While the scope of the boundary study only included these cluster elementary schools, the recommendation does incorporate much of the data, again, similar to Gaithersburg, based upon those 4 factors that we use to develop our options. Next slide. To formulate the recommendation, the interim superintendent again reviewed all of the options that were developed, as well as the stakeholder input that was received in the context of those 4 policy factors. Again, reviewed the district-wide boundary analysis, and after looking at all of that information, utilization, our updated capacity, our updated enrollment, and enrollment projections, the interim superintendent's recommendation is option 1, which she believed that this option most advanced those 4 factors. Next slide, please. And here is the interim superintendent's recommendation. It reassigns zones B3 and B8 from Bethesda to Somerset, and reassigns S2, 3, 4, and 5 from Somerset to Westbrook. So you can see this is an easier map to look at. You can see B3 and B8 that are now reassigned from Bethesda, the green, to the brown or gold color. And you can see again S2, 3, 4, and 5, which were Somerset zones that are now being recommended to be reassigned to Westbrook, which is in the blue. So again, the green is the recommended zones for Bethesda. The gold is the recommended zones for Somerset, and the blue are the recommended zones for Westbrook. And again, you can look at the farms percentages, the current and then the change, the proposed change for Bethesda goes from 12% to 13%, Somerset from 12 to 9.7%, and Westbrook from 1.2 to 6.6%. Can look again at the utilization, and Bethesda was the most overutilized. We brought it down, I think it was about 130%, brought it down to 106%. Somerset is at 80%, and Westbrook is at 90%. And again, we talked about Somerset, the concerns that we have, it being the second smallest site. Challenges definitely putting relocatables on that site. So allowing a little bit more flexibility at Somerset is something that we did look at and talk to Dr. McKnight about, and with this recommendation. And you can see from a geography standpoint, all of these zones are contiguous. All 3 zones are contiguous. Next slide, please. You actually can see this one a little bit better because there are less schools. So when we talk about the overutilization, you can see that Bethesda, based upon, and this is this year's data, there was some things that we had heard that some people were saying, or community members were concerned that we weren't using this year's numbers. We were looking at pre-pandemic. That's actually not true. The superintendent's recommendation, actually, the recommendation that came out on October 15th, we used September 20th data, which is a little pre-preliminary, but these numbers, this data and information is preliminary September 30th data. This year's enrollment information, and the projections are what is included in the CIP that you all received on Friday. So you can see the no change. If Bethesda was not changed at all, they'd be 133% overutilized, and this brings them down to 31% overutilized. Bethesda would be, Somerset would be a little overutilized.
So say that again, 133 down to 106.
Yes, yeah. Yes, from 183 overutilized to 31 students overutilized. So it's a drop of about 150 students. Somerset Elementary School is a little overutilized in the last year of the CIP, and this brings them down again to about 100 seats available, which is about 3 classrooms flexibility, wiggle room to have them have that growth and not worry about placing relocatables. And then Westbrook had those seats available. They had it prior to adding the 3 classroom shell and had additional seats. That brings them up to, I believe it's 615 if I'm looking correctly. And that gives them about 90% utilized with this recommendation. And again, you can look at the farms percentages and what those changes are based upon the recommendation. Next slide. Implementation. This implementation is a whole lot easier. It is our straightforward implementation. It is the recommendation to grandfather grade 5 students so that in the 2022-23 school year, this coming school year, next school year, only pre-kindergarten through grade 4 would be reassigned, and then full implementation would be the following year. I do want to say and reiterate and stress that in last year's CIP, we did have an opening of the shell build-out for 2023, so it would have opened in 2023. As part of this recommendation, however, it will open this coming school year. So when you implement the boundary study, the seats, the shell build-out will be there. Probably we would have been just a little bit or right there at 100% if the shell build-out wasn't there. So the implementation, the recommendation could have still happened, but in the recommendation as part of the CIP, we are accelerating that shell build-out so that it will be open when the reassignment occurs in August of 2022. Okay. Next slide, please. So a summary of the recommendation: it maintains the current walk areas for the schools. It provides compact and contiguous boundaries for all the schools. It does not reduce all the overutilization at Bethesda. We saw it leaves them a little bit overutilized. However, as you all know, there is a new elementary school in the out years of the CIP. I believe it's 25 and 26 for planning funds for a new elementary school for Bethesda and WJ. That came online a couple of years ago. We did talk about a new elementary school for the Walter Johnson cluster. We talked about a new elementary school for the Bethesda Chevy Chase cluster. There wasn't enough overutilization in each one of them, and so the recommendation, which was put into the CIP in the 21-26 CIP, I believe, was to do a joint or have that elementary school address both the overutilization in the BCC and WJ clusters. And those planning funds are still in the approved CIP and the recommended CIP. Next slide. So the summary, and we're just going through this quickly about the other options that were developed. Options 2, 4, and 5 were not recommended because they did not address the utilization factor for Bethesda Elementary School as well as option 1. Options 3, 6, and 7 were not recommended. While they did reduce the utilization at Bethesda more than option 1, options 3 and 7 kept Westbrook almost at capacity. And remember where Westbrook is. It is the southernmost point of the cluster, almost of our boundaries in general. And so if they became overutilized, then you're looking at dominoing back up again in the future to address that overutilization. Also, they reassigned the furthest zones from Bethesda directly to Westbrook. And so that's why those 2 were not recommended. And option 6 left Somerset, again, the second smallest elementary school in the county, overutilized. Options 8 and 9 were not recommended because they did not address the utilization, geography, and demographic factors, as well as option 1. Next slide. And that is it for supplement B.
Thank you. It's quite a bit of information. I have a couple of questions. Are whole classrooms being moved to Westbrook? Or I know that you do it by students, but I'm wondering, are there whole classrooms that will be moved over there? Do you know?
So the way that they're done is by zones. So within each of those zones, there are students that are in first grade, second grade, third grade. So it is not an entire classroom, 30 kids that would be reassigned, because they will be mixed based upon that zone that gets reassigned.
Okay, but it's the whole zone that's being
It's the whole zone, correct. So any students that are in that zone that fit K to 4 the first year, and then, of course, 5 just becomes grade 5 from that 4th grade that gets reassigned.
And I know you provided this information to me before, but can you provide before Thursday the dates that you had public meetings and the attendance numbers?
Yes, I believe it may be in the report, and so we will share that.
I'm sure I saw it, but if you could just pull it out, I can't remember where. I know I had it. And can I get the demographic breakdown as far as you can tell based on this year's numbers for the new school, for the new positioning? In other words, you gave us the farms numbers, you gave us the ESOL numbers. Can you break it down into the racial numbers that are being moved?
Sure.
Thank you. Am I seeing any lights on? Does anybody else have anything? Ms. Mandrowski?
I just want to clarify, because I know some people have written in about relocating students this year. No one's being relocated this year.
No, because we're in the middle of the year.
Right.
So it
I
would
just wanted
not, it would, the Board of Education would approve it again this November, and then implementation would start in August of '22.
Okay, just wanted to make it clear for the public. Thank you.
Ms. Silvestri?
Yes, in slide 72, where you have the chart with all the projections and demographics, we don't have this current school year on there, right?
So so the demographics that are shown on slide 72, thank you. Actually, I'm going to just use what's here too. It is the so you can see the demographics is the 2020-2021 school year. The change, so we use those numbers to then make the change. We don't ever project demographics.
No, I was asking for actual, what's the count for this school year is not on here. Because we're getting feedback that we're using pre-COVID data, I would like to see what this school year's enrollment is at each of these schools, and I don't see that anywhere.
So the enrollment is this year's. So it's preliminary September 30th, and then it's the projection. So in the CIP that you received, it's the same numbers as what's in the CIP.
So you're saying that for Bethesda, this year's enrollment is 645?
So that's 22-23. I can tell you what their preliminary September 30th number is. So for Bethesda, it is 641 students. That's what is the preliminary September 30th from this school year.
What page is that in the book?
It is page 4-8. And then the projections that are shown are the projections that would be no change, and then the projections that would be the change based upon the recommendation. And the data that's in the CIP is based on the superintendent's recommendation, so it's reflective of the change.
Thank you. Dr. McKnight, when we do the demographic changes, in particular with Westbrook did they have 0 ESOL before?
So when we show a 0, it's because the number is small, and so the roll-up becomes 0, so it's less than, I think it's less than 5 students.
Okay. But I guess my point is we are increasing the ESOL to nearly 20%, and that will be better programmatically, I would imagine, because you're not talking about a point fraction allocation, you're talking about a more significant allocation.
Yes.
Okay. And how does Bethesda Elementary School deal with those overcrowding currently? Does it have portables? Because we're leaving it a little bit overcrowded, and with all the development happening, And the fact that this shared elementary school is still a long ways away, I was just wondering how we plan to deal with the continued overcrowding at Bethesda Elementary School.
So currently, they have 6 relocatable classrooms. So based upon this, the recommendation, it reassigns approximately 150 students. So that would significantly impact their overutilization, should reduce their number of relocatables. The idea certainly is to keep those relocatables there, certainly through next school year, to see where the boundary study, how the students, of course, there's 5th graders that get grandfathered, so of course they're going to still have some students there that wouldn't be reassigned, and then going from there. The idea, we look at the 6 years, that number, that's the 6-year number. So certainly, once it's implemented, that 6-year number is only having about 31 students overutilized. So that's maybe a relocatable or 2. So certainly the number of relocatables that they have should more than address any overutilization that they may have, and that would be way into the future.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think that's it for today. I really thank you. This was a lot of information for us to digest, and look forward to our Thursday conversation on this issue.
Can you remind us what's happening on Thursday?
Don't we have a work session
But
on?
how is it different from this?
Well, this session was for them to present their recommendations. On Thursday, we will delve into our questions about the recommendations.
So,
Oh, tomorrow, I'm sorry, there is one tomorrow. The board meeting is dedicated to this tomorrow. There's an item. Oh, jeez.
and it is specifically on just the 2 boundary studies. So.
You're right, I remember that, thank you.
Right, so any opportunity, any additional
Right.
questions that you may have, we can answer additional questions at that meeting. If the board decides they want to put, as you said in your introduction, put alternatives on the table, that would be the opportunity that you can do it then, because then it would be prior to the public hearings that are already established. And then the meeting on Thursday is an opportunity, again, if there's any questions, we may provide some more information on the CIP, if there's any CIP questions, or any further questions on either one of the boundary studies.
Thank you, because there are so many meetings scheduled this week until it was hard to remember. I knew that there was one Thursday, so thank you for that information. And thank you again for all that you do, because this is a very complicated system, and it was a very complicated report. And I look forward to our continued discussion on it. Thank you. We're adjourned.